Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The body on the bench. I always start my morning runs early. The streets are quieter, the air fresher, and the solitude allows me to clear my head before the chaos of the day. It's a simple routine that keeps me grounded, and in some ways, I look forward to it more than I should. But this morning, something felt off. I had just crossed a small park near my apartment when I noticed him. A man, sitting on one of the benches, his back to me. He wasn't doing anything particularly strange, just sitting there with his hands folded in his lap. His posture was stiff, unnervingly so, but at first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The man was older, his hair gray and unkempt, his clothes disheveled as if he had just stumbled out of bed. There was something odd about the way he sat, though. His stillness didn't feel normal, almost as if he were frozen in time. I passed him without a second thought, my feet hitting the pavement in a rhythmic pattern as I made my way around the park. My thoughts were still foggy from sleep, but something about the man lingered in my mind. His presence felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I turned around to head back, I expected to see him still sitting there. But when I passed the bench again, it was empty. Just like that, he was gone. At first, I assumed he had gotten up while I wasn't looking, maybe heading toward the nearby street or wandering deeper into the park. But something felt different. I glanced at the bench again, scanning the area for any sign of the man, but there was nothing. Except for one thing. A book. It was lying open on the bench, pages fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. I stopped, my curiosity piqued. Who leaves a book behind, especially in such a quiet, desolate place? I took a few cautious steps closer, scanning the title, though the letters were blurry at first glance. It was an old book, worn at the edges and yellowed with age. I felt a strange tug of unease as I bent down to pick it up. My fingers grazed the paper, and the moment I touched the cover, a chill ran up my spine. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the book was waiting for me. I looked around again, half expecting to see the man return to explain why he left this book behind. But the park was still, empty, as if nothing had happened at all. The book's pages fluttered open on their own as I glanced down, revealing a passage of text. But it wasn't just any text. The words were familiar, far too familiar. The passage was one I had read just last night, before going to bed. A book I had checked out from the library, one I thought was a random choice. I had never read it before, but now here it was, in front of me, on a bench in a park I passed every day. But the strangest part? The date written in the corner of the page. It was today's date. Exactly. I stood frozen, my mind racing. What was going on? How could this be? There was no way this could be a coincidence, no way that the book, which I had never seen before this morning, had the exact date marked on it. I turned the page, and another passage was revealed. The words seemed to jump off the page at me, seeping into my brain with an unsettling clarity. He will come when you least expect it. And when he does, the book will be your guide. I read it again, unable to believe what I was seeing. The book didn't feel like it was meant for me. It felt as though it had been placed there, waiting for me, as if someone or something had planned this moment. A sound broke through my thoughts, a soft rustling from behind. I froze, my pulse quickening. Slowly, I turned around. There, standing at the edge of the park, was the man. He was staring at me with an intense, almost empty gaze, his face expressionless. But it wasn't the man that chilled me to my core. It was the book, now in my hands, and the way his gaze never wavered from me. He had been waiting for me, waiting for the moment when I would pick up the book, when I would understand the meaning of his presence. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away. I stood there, still holding the book, unsure of what had just happened. The man was gone again, fading into the distance like he had never been there. But I knew something had changed. Something was following me, something that couldn't be explained. The book, still open in my hands, held the answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I couldn't bring myself to leave the park just yet. My legs felt heavy, as though the very air around me had thickened. Every part of me screamed to run, to leave the book on that bench and never look back, but something kept me tethered to the moment. The pages fluttered once more in my hands, and despite myself, I turned the next page. The next passage was even more disturbing. Tonight, you will see the man again. He will bring with him the answer you seek, but at a cost. Do not ignore him. Do not look away. I stared at the words. My heart began to race. I hadn't planned on seeing the man again, nor had I sought any answers. But now that the book had predicted it, it felt like an inevitability. As if the events were already unfolding, guided by an invisible hand. I looked around the park one last time, as if expecting the man to reappear, but there was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the distant hum of the city felt normal. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing except for me standing in the middle of it all, clutching this strange book with an unnerving sense of urgency. The rest of my run was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the book, about the man, about the ominous warning. My mind was spiraling with questions and fears. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, but every time I glanced at the book, my pulse quickened. When I reached my apartment, I tossed it onto the table, as if somehow doing so would rid me of the unease. But that night, when I went to bed, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. The man, the book, the message. The feeling that something was closing in around me, like I was being watched. I couldn't escape the nagging thought that I wasn't in control of this situation, that the choices weren't mine to make. As the night dragged on, I eventually drifted off, my thoughts muddled and restless. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, long after I had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, that I was jolted awake by a sound. A soft knock on my door. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I hesitated. Who could be at my door at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock had been so quiet, almost tentative. Another knock. This time louder, more insistent. I crept to the door, my heart pounding. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Who would be out there, in the dead of night? I looked through the peephole. My stomach dropped. The man. The same one I had seen in the park. He was standing outside my door, his face expressionless, his eyes locked on the peephole. I stepped back, panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't let him in. I hadn't opened the door, yet here he was. The same strange feeling of inevitability that had overtaken me earlier in the park swept over me again. The knock came again, this time louder. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the first move. Without thinking, I grabbed the book from the table and rushed to the window. I threw it open, looking out at the empty street below. But the man wasn't gone. He was still standing there, waiting, watching. I couldn't understand it. What did he want from me? Why was he here? A new message appeared on the open page of the book, scrawled in a hurried hand that hadn't been there before. You cannot escape what is already coming. I felt the weight of the words pressing down on me. This wasn't just a strange coincidence anymore. It was as if the events were predestined, and I had no way to stop them. The man, the book, the strange warnings, they were all part of something bigger, something I was too small to comprehend. I turned to face the door, my hands trembling. The knock came again, louder this time, as if the man was growing impatient. But I knew one thing for sure, whether I opened that door or not, I was already a part of whatever was coming next. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the door, paralyzed by fear. Every part of me screamed to run, to hide, to do anything but confront what was outside. But the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a long, tense silence. It felt like the air had thickened around me, as if the world was holding its breath. The man was still out there. I could feel his presence, his waiting. There was no more avoiding this. I glanced at the book in my hands, still open to the page with the hastily written message. The words seemed to glow in the dim light of my apartment, as if they were alive, watching me. You cannot escape what is already coming. The door knocked again, more insistent, like it was part of a countdown, each strike a reminder that I was out of time. My hand shook as I set the book down on the table. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face him, but something inside me told me that I had no choice. With a deep breath, I reached for the doorknob. My mind raced with thoughts of what I might find on the other side. Would he be there, standing silently, as if he had always been meant to be there? Or was this all some twisted nightmare, a game I had unwittingly become a part of? The moment my hand touched the knob, the door creaked. Not just any creak, this was a slow, deliberate sound, as though the door itself was waking from a long slumber. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't open it, but I could feel it, a pull, something magnetic about the presence beyond that door. I took one more step back, glancing around the room as if searching for something to help me understand what was happening. The apartment felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me. My breath came faster, shorter. The knock came again. The sound reverberated through me, a jarring reminder that this wasn't something I could ignore. The window. I turned and looked toward it, my escape. I could climb out, run away from this, whatever it was. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was pointless. The man had been standing right outside my door, and no matter where I went, he would be there, watching. I turned back to the door. The knocking had stopped. There was only silence now. Complete, suffocating silence. I reached for the doorknob again, my hand still trembling, but this time, something was different. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the weight of inevitability. The pull from the other side, the sense that opening this door was the only option left. As if I had been following a path all along, one that I could not stray from. The knob turned in my hand. I opened the door. The hallway outside was empty. Nothing was there. No man, no sign of anyone. I stepped out into the silence, heart racing, breath shallow. The air felt colder than it had moments before. My feet were hesitant, unsure where to go. Then, a whisper. It was a sound, barely audible, but it came from the direction of the stairs, soft, almost like a murmur. I followed the sound, each step slow, cautious. It wasn't the man's voice. This was something different, something just beyond the edge of hearing. The whisper grew clearer, but the words were still indistinct, swallowed by the air. The closer I got to the stairwell, the more intense the feeling became. Something was there, something I was about to face. I reached the top of the stairs, but the whisper suddenly stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stepped forward, glancing down at the empty hall. Nothing. But then, on the floor, there was something I hadn't seen before. A book. The same book that had been in my hands just moments ago. It lay open, as if it had been waiting for me. The pages turned gently, as though a breeze was blowing through them, but there was no wind. The book beckoned. I couldn't help myself. I reached down and picked it up. The same words were there, the ones I had read earlier. But now, there was more. A new message had appeared on the page. It has already begun. The story is no longer yours to tell. I felt a chill wash over me. The message was clear. This wasn't just a strange event I was witnessing. It was a story that had been written long before I ever became a part of it. And somehow, no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to escape it, I was trapped. The man, the book, the whispers, they were all part of something much larger than I could understand. I was no longer in control of my own story. I was just a character. And I was about to learn what happened when the story had already been written. I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, holding the book in my hands, my mind racing. The cold, creeping dread I felt earlier was now replaced with an overwhelming sense of inevitability. What did it all mean? The whispers, the book, the man at my door, they were all leading me somewhere, and I had no idea where it would end. I turned the page, my fingers trembling as I did. The words had changed again, but this time they weren't a message. Instead, they were a description. A description of me. The ink seemed to darken, as if the words were being written as I stood there reading them. The man watches from the corner. He sees her hesitate. She knows she cannot run. She must open the door, but she is afraid of what will come next. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The book was talking about me, about what was happening right now, and it was clear that I had no control over the next steps. I wasn't reading a book. I was reading my own fate. I closed the book quickly, as if the act of closing it might stop whatever was happening. But it didn't. The silence in the hallway deepened. The air was thick with something unnatural. I needed to get out of there, but where could I go? The book had shown me that I wasn't safe anywhere. I turned back toward my apartment door, only to find it ajar. It hadn't been like that when I had stepped out. It wasn't even slightly open, it was wide, the dark void of my apartment waiting to swallow me back in. I stepped back, holding the book close to my chest as if it could protect me. My breathing was shallow, panicked. The hallway felt longer now, the walls closing in. The darkness behind me was oppressive, like it was waiting for me to return, to be swallowed whole. Then I heard it. The whisper again. But this time, it was louder. Clearer. You can't hide. I spun around, looking for the source. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty hallway, stretching out in front of me, the soft glow from the light above casting long shadows on the walls. It was as though the sound had come from inside my own head, as if my mind had finally cracked under the pressure of everything happening. But that wasn't possible, was it? I didn't dare look back at the apartment door. I couldn't bring myself to. Every part of me wanted to flee, to run as far away as possible, but my legs felt like lead. The book weighed heavily in my hands, pulling me down, anchoring me to the spot where I stood. The whisper came again, but now it was no longer a whisper. It was a voice, low and raspy, but unmistakably human. Come back. It's already too late. It sounded like the voice was coming from within the apartment, from the shadows of my own home, inviting me back. The temptation to run was strong, but something deeper inside me, something darker, urged me to walk back toward the door. I couldn't fight it. I stepped forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The book seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the words inside shifting, as though the story was moving around me, changing in real time. As I reached the door, I hesitated just for a moment, my hand hovering above the knob. I knew it was stupid to go back in there, to confront whatever lay behind that door. But I had no choice. I opened it. The apartment was just as I left it. Empty. Silent. But there was something different now. Something off about it. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching across the walls, filling the corners. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. And there, in the corner of the room, was the figure. The man. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He was standing in the same spot where I had last seen him, but now his form was no longer just a shadow. It was solid, real. His features were obscured by the darkness, but his presence was undeniable. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I told you, the voice from the book whispered again, but now it was no longer the whisper of an unknown entity. It was his voice. It's too late. You've read this story, and now you're part of it. I wanted to scream, to run, to throw the book away and forget everything. But something stopped me. The pull of the story, the pull of his eyes, kept me rooted in place. I couldn't break free. I couldn't escape. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in. The man took a slow step forward, his eyes now gleaming in the darkness, and I knew then he wasn't here to hurt me. No. He was here to finish the story. And I was its final chapter. The darkness closed in, and I was pulled into the page. The story had ended, and I had become part of it. But I would never leave. The last thing I heard, before everything went black, was the final line in the book. The story continues, but she will never know how it ends. I woke up, but not in the way I had expected. I was back in the hallway, standing in front of my apartment door as if nothing had happened. The book was still in my hand, the pages flicking lightly in the draft. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind spinning. Had it been a dream? A nightmare that had left me tangled in reality and something far worse? But there was no time to question it. The door, still open, waited for me, as though it had been calling me all along. I stood frozen, unable to look away, unsure of what to do next. Everything seemed wrong. I reached for the door handle again, this time with a strange, reluctant certainty. The apartment was quiet, untouched, yet somehow it felt different. It was as if the air had thickened, as though the shadows had grown bolder and stretched further into the room. I stepped inside. The man was gone, but the oppressive sense of his presence still lingered. The space felt colder, as if something had shifted in the very fabric of the apartment. It was the same layout, the same furniture, but the atmosphere was different. Every object, every detail seemed to be waiting for something to happen. For me to understand. I sat down at the small table in the corner. The book was still open in my hands, though I couldn't remember opening it. As my eyes scanned the pages, my stomach twisted. There it was again. The text had changed. She thought she had escaped, but she had only begun to understand. The story doesn't end for the ones who read it. They become part of it. Forever. I was part of it now. I wasn't just a reader anymore. I had become another piece in the puzzle. And that realization, more terrifying than anything, hit me all at once. The walls seemed to pulse around me. The silence was deafening, pressing in. I wanted to scream, to throw the book down and run, but I knew that the moment I did, I'd be trapped in another cycle, one that would never end. Then, I heard a soft creaking. At first, it was so faint I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just behind me. I spun around, but the apartment was empty. No man, no shadows, just the hollow, mocking silence. The book. I realized, with a start, that the book was the only thing holding me to this world, to this reality. It had become the tether, the only thing that kept me grounded. But I couldn't escape it. I had read it, and now I was part of it. As I stood there, feeling the weight of the story sink into me, I heard a voice again. A whisper, not from the book this time, but from somewhere behind me. You are not alone. I turned, but nothing was there. Just the same empty room. But I could feel it now. I wasn't alone. The walls closed in, and the book in my hand felt colder than ever, as if it was made of ice. I stepped backward, my mind screaming at me to get out, but there was no escape. The story had already begun, and it wasn't just my story anymore. It was everyone's. And it was far from finished. The next morning, I found myself sitting at the same table, in the same apartment, as if nothing had changed. The world outside seemed untouched, normal. The sun streamed through the windows, casting light on everything, but somehow, it only made the room feel colder. And then, the knock came. I knew who it was before I opened the door. There, standing in the hallway, was the man. The same man from the book. The one whose presence haunted me in every corner of my mind. He wasn't standing still this time, though. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving mine, his face unreadable. "It's time," he said, his voice low and calm, as though this were a normal conversation. The story never ends. It just waits for the next reader. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape him, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. His presence filled the doorway, consumed the space between us. I glanced at the book, still in my hands, and the words had changed again. It was no longer a story. It was a warning. A warning for whoever would come next. The door is always open, and those who read will always return. I could hear my own breath, shallow and rapid. And then I realized something that froze me even more than the dark figure in front of me. I wasn't the first. This was no accident. I had been chosen. This was a cycle, an endless loop of people who had read the book, and now their fate was mine. I was the next chapter, and my story would repeat itself for someone else. The man stepped forward again, and I took a step back, stumbling. The book seemed to pulse in my hands, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. As he crossed the threshold, I felt the coldness envelope me. And just before everything went dark, I heard his final words. "You're just another story waiting to be read." The door slammed shut behind me, and I was gone. The book remained open on the table, its pages still turning. The cycle continued. The Fountain in the Park. Chapter 1. The Coin. It all began with a simple decision, a decision that felt so ordinary at the time. I had been walking through the park, not really paying attention to anything around me. The day had been dull, the gray clouds hanging low in the sky, casting a dull glow over everything. People walked by, some with their heads down, others lost in their own thoughts, just as I was. The park, usually a place of calm, had somehow become a little too quiet. I had come to the fountain, an old stone structure at the heart of the park. The water was murky, the moss covering the sides of the fountain giving it a look of neglect. The sound of the water splashing against the stones was soothing, but even in that peaceful moment, there was something unsettling about it. I didn't know why I was drawn to this fountain, or why I felt compelled to stand there for a while, just staring at it. The air seemed to grow colder the longer I stood still, and my thoughts began to drift. Suddenly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a coin. Without thinking, I tossed it into the fountain, watching it spin in the air before sinking into the murky water. The moment it hit the surface, I felt a strange shiver run through my spine. I shook it off, laughing nervously to myself, but the sensation lingered. I turned to leave, but then something happened. A voice, soft and unfamiliar, whispered in my ear. "Did you think it would work?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned around, looking for anyone nearby. The park was still, no one in sight. I had been alone by the fountain, so who had spoken? I laughed it off again, my nerves jangling. The voice, though soft, had sounded too real. Too close. I took a few steps away from the fountain, trying to shake off the odd feeling creeping up my spine. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the wind playing tricks. But then, the voice came again, clearer this time, as if it were in my head. "Did you really think it would work?" I stopped in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. The voice had come from inside my mind, yet it felt as though it had come from someone else entirely. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I couldn't explain it. I glanced around the park again. There was no one who could have spoken. I was alone. I took a deep breath and told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the unease grew. That voice, that soft whisper. It wasn't something I could ignore. I walked away from the fountain, my steps quickening as the feeling of being watched lingered. The voice had stopped, but the silence around me felt heavier now. Every little sound seemed amplified, leaves rustling, footsteps in the distance, even my own breathing felt too loud. As I walked further into the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just a voice. Something else was happening. Something I couldn't explain. The strange feeling stayed with me all day, growing stronger with each passing moment. Every now and then, I thought I heard a whisper, a faint voice saying something just beyond the reach of my understanding. It was like the words were on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't quite grasp them. It unsettled me more than I cared to admit. By the time I got home, the voice had stopped, but the unease had not. It was like a shadow, following me through my thoughts. Every moment felt strained, like I was waiting for something. Waiting for what? I couldn't say, but I knew something had changed. Something had happened when I tossed that coin into the fountain. And whatever it wasn't over. Not yet. The following morning, the unease hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had intensified. I woke up with a strange weight in my chest, a constant pressure that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the after effects of a bad night's sleep, but as the day wore on, the sensation of something watching me only grew stronger. I couldn't stop thinking about the fountain. Why had I tossed that coin in? It was a stupid, impulsive act, but it felt like something more now. I kept wondering if I had somehow opened a door I couldn't close. I walked through the park again that day, my eyes scanning the surroundings, half expecting to hear that voice again. The air felt heavier than before, thick with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I passed by the fountain and felt an inexplicable urge to stop. The water was still as murky as before, the moss covering the stones like a blanket of neglect. It was the same fountain, the same peaceful scene. But something was different. I felt a tremor of fear race through me, a cold wave crashing down on my spine. "You're here again," the voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, turning to look around. There was no one near me, no one in sight. The park was empty. I couldn't even hear the usual sounds of distant footsteps or birdsong. It was as if the world had gone completely still. The voice wasn't in my head this time. It was coming from somewhere, close by. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned slowly toward the fountain. "Why did you come back?" it asked, the words curling in the air like smoke, wrapping around me, suffocating me. I took a step back, my legs unsteady, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some random echo or trick of the wind. Someone was watching me, was speaking to me. And it wasn't just a voice anymore. It felt like there was a presence, something dark and unseen, just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the pavement, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of what was happening. The world around me seemed to blur, the edges of everything bending and warping. I could hear it now, footsteps behind me. Slow. Methodical. Not my own. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just empty space. Yet the footsteps, the breathing, they were there, so close. The sound was growing louder, echoing through my mind, and I could feel my sanity slipping, thread by thread. "You're not alone," the voice taunted, the words coming from all directions, as if it were inside my head and all around me at the same time. I stumbled, almost falling to the ground, as a cold wind swept through the park, making the trees rustle. The air grew thick with tension, a sense of impending doom wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The footsteps faded. The park returned to its eerie silence. But it didn't feel like silence. It felt wrong. Like something was lurking, waiting. I stood there, my chest heaving, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to make of it. Was I losing my mind? Was this just a breakdown, a figment of my imagination? Or was something truly happening to me? Something I couldn't explain. I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that something had changed the moment I tossed that coin into the fountain. And whatever it was far from over. The next few days passed in a haze, a blur of unease and confusion. The voice had stopped, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. At night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, seemed like a warning. The sensation of being watched was constant, creeping along the edges of my thoughts, tightening around my chest until I could barely breathe. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always there, just beyond my reach. The world outside had become quieter, too. The usual hum of city life, the distant sound of cars, the laughter of children in the park, everything felt muffled, as though I was living in a world that was slowly slipping away. I walked through the streets like a ghost, disconnected from everything around me. People smiled, said hello, but their voices felt distant, like echoes of a life I no longer recognized. It was the park that drew me back, once again. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish, that I was just chasing some irrational fear. But I knew I had to go. Something was pulling me there, as if I had no choice. When I arrived, the park was quiet. Empty, save for a few distant walkers who disappeared quickly into the trees. The fountain stood there, unchanged, the water still murky and undisturbed. I approached it cautiously, every instinct telling me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. I had to see it again. As I stood in front of the fountain, a voice broke the silence. "You've come back," it whispered, but this time it wasn't soft. It was sharp, direct, like a command. I turned around, my heart racing. There was no one behind me. The park was as empty as it had been moments before. "Why did you come back?" The voice asked again, louder this time, more insistent. It felt like it was inside me, pushing against my thoughts, invading my mind. I backed away from the fountain, but my legs felt heavy, unresponsive. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The world around me seemed to tilt, the air growing thick, suffocating. Every sound around me, every rustling leaf, every distant bird felt magnified, distorted. Then, the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just one. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, overlapping, a cacophony of whispers. "You shouldn't have thrown the coin," they said in unison. "You shouldn't have come." I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. My mind was trapped, tangled in the web of voices. Each word felt like a stone being thrown into my chest, weighing me down, crushing me. "Do you hear us?" the voices asked. "Do you feel us?" The world began to shift, bending and warping around me. The park was no longer familiar. The trees, the paths, the distant benches, everything was twisted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. The fountain was still there, but its water had turned black, a deep, unnatural void that seemed to pull at me, drawing me in. "You're not alone," the voices murmured, their tone growing more sinister. "We've been waiting for you." In that moment, I understood. The fountain, the coin, the voices, it was all connected. The moment I tossed that coin, I had unlocked something. Something that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to break free. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me closed in, the air growing thick with an oppressive force. My mind was spinning, unraveling, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, into the depths of the fountain. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. Silence. The park was still. The fountain was just a fountain again, its water calm and clear. The voices were gone. But I wasn't the same. I could feel it inside me. Something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier, like I was walking through a dream I couldn't wake up from. I turned to leave, but every step felt like I was moving through thick molasses, every breath harder to take. The voices had stopped, but the presence, the weight, was still there. It was as though it had seeped into my very bones, into my soul, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would follow. I was no longer alone. Not in my mind, and not in the world around me. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that I would never be free from it. The days blurred into one another after that moment at the fountain. I tried to go about my life as if everything were normal, as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew it was impossible. The voices had left a mark on me, a scar that I could not erase. Each step I took in the world felt different now, like the ground beneath me was unstable, like I wasn't truly grounded in reality anymore. I returned home, hoping the familiar walls would offer some comfort, some sense of normalcy. But even inside, I couldn't escape the suffocating presence that lingered in my mind. The silence in my apartment wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I found myself drawn to mirrors more than usual. I'd catch my reflection in the bathroom, in windows, in passing storefronts. My own face looked unfamiliar now, as if the person staring back at me wasn't the same person who had tossed that coin into the fountain. My eyes, once sharp and clear, now felt distant, as if they were staring at something just beyond my reach. The whispers were quieter now, but they were still there. Faint echoes, barely audible, always just out of grasp. They would come to me in the dead of night, in the quiet moments when I thought I was alone. Sometimes it was a voice, a single word. Other times it was a rush of sounds, an indistinct murmur that filled the room. You shouldn't have come back. Did you think you could escape? Do you hear us? It was never enough to understand. The voices never offered clarity, only confusion, only torment. One night, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the cup of coffee in front of me. The silence seemed louder than ever, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. My mind kept racing with thoughts of the fountain, of the coin, of the voices. What had I unleashed? What had I done? I could feel it then. A presence in the room, watching me. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I wasn't alone, not anymore. Suddenly, the air shifted, as if the room had grown colder. My breath fogged in front of me, despite the warmth of the heater humming in the background. I looked up sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. The light in the room flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear any footsteps, but I could feel the weight of someone, or something, standing just beyond my line of sight. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. Then, the voice came again, closer this time, as if it were right next to me. You should have left when you had the chance. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I wanted to scream, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. The presence was too real now, too close. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the suffocating air. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? The room seemed to pulse, as if responding to my question. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath now, swirling in the dim light. The voice answered, but this time it wasn't just one. It was many, a chorus of whispers, all overlapping, all speaking in different tones, as if they were inside my mind, each one pressing against my thoughts, trying to break through. You released us, the voices said in unison. Now you will never be free. I felt something shift, a ripple in the air, a distortion in the space around me. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Something was moving, something was coming closer. My skin crawled with the sensation of it, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, as if the room itself had become a prison. You belong to us now, the voices whispered, their words sinking into my mind, digging into my very thoughts. You will never escape. I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The presence, the weight, the voices, they were everywhere, inside me, around me, pushing and pulling at my sanity. I felt my mind unraveling, my grip on reality slipping away. I could no longer tell what was real and what was a hallucination, what was a whisper and what was my own voice echoing back at me. I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if something were trying to break free, something dark and suffocating. I gasped for air, but it was harder and harder to breathe. The room felt smaller now, closing in on me, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The air returned to normal. The temperature rose, and the light flickered back to its usual steady glow. The room was still, silent. But the damage had already been done. I wasn't alone anymore. The voices had never truly left. They had always been there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the moment to return. And now, they had taken me. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like a heavy curtain that fell over everything, suffocating any remaining sense of reality. I was still standing in my kitchen, my hands gripping the counter as I tried to steady myself. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room felt too quiet, too still. But there was something more, something that couldn't be seen, but could only be felt. The absence of sound wasn't peace. It was something darker. It was waiting. I didn't dare look at the clock. I knew time had stopped, but the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. My mind was consumed by the whispers. They had never really stopped. They had only been lying in wait, growing stronger, more insistent, until they drowned out everything else. You're ours, they said, not as a threat anymore, but as a statement. A fact. I could feel them, all of them, inside my head. Their voices were tangled in my thoughts, in my soul, and I had no way to escape. The air around me felt thick with their presence, as if they had filled every corner of the room, every crack in the walls. It wasn't just my mind that had changed, the world itself had warped, and I could feel it bending around me, becoming something I couldn't recognize. My reflection in the kitchen window caught my eye. It wasn't mine anymore. The person staring back at me had the same face, the same eyes, but there was something wrong with it. The eyes were too distant, too hollow, as if the person I had once been had already gone. The face was an echo, a ghost of who I had been, wearing the skin of someone still breathing, still standing. And then the voices returned. But now, they weren't just whispers. They were clear, distinct, as if each one were standing right next to me. You made a choice, one voice said, its tone dark and amused. And now, you belong to us. forever. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only listen to them, hear them invading every part of my mind. I tried to scream, to shout, to call out for help, but nothing came out. The silence around me thickened, but it wasn't the absence of sound, it was the weight of something unseen, something oppressive that pressed down on me, around me, inside me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a single sound broke through the silence. A soft, almost imperceptible splash, like a coin falling into water. My heart stopped. The sound came again. A coin sinking into the depths of the fountain. The same fountain. The coin I had tossed, the coin that had set everything in motion. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching out, trembling. I could feel the weight of the air around me pulling me toward the park, toward the fountain. I couldn't explain why, but I knew. The fountain held the answer. It was calling me. It had always been calling me. I stepped outside, my feet moving on their own, as if I were being dragged through the streets. The world outside seemed unreal now, distorted. The trees, the buildings, they all blurred together as I walked, almost like a painting in motion, colors bleeding together. I reached the park. The fountain stood there, as silent and still as ever. But now, as I approached, I could see it. The water was no longer black. It was clear, shimmering in the dim light of the street lamps. The surface rippled slightly, as though disturbed by something beneath it. Something waiting. I stood before it, unable to move, unable to tear my gaze away from the water. The whispers filled my mind once more, louder now, more demanding. Come closer, they urged. Look into the water. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But my feet moved of their own accord, stepping closer to the fountain, drawn by an invisible force. The water churned, and then, rising from the depths, something emerged. A shape. Dark, twisting, something that wasn't fully formed but was real. Real enough to be felt, to be feared. It was not human. It was a mass of shifting shadows, with eyes that burned bright like embers, staring at me from beneath the water. Its voice was everywhere, inside my mind, my body, my very soul. You released us, it hissed. And now you will pay the price. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The presence, no, the creature, was too powerful. It had seeped into every corner of my mind, every inch of my being. It was no longer just a voice. It was a force, a living nightmare, and it was too late to escape. And then, I felt it. A sharp, searing pain in my chest, as though something was tearing through me from the inside. I gasped for air, my body racked with pain. The voices, the creature, they were consuming me, pulling me into the dark, into the water, into the depths of the fountain. I was falling into the darkness, into the void, into the endless whispers. The last thing I heard was the splash of the coin sinking into the fountain. And then, nothing. The park was quiet again. The fountain, still as ever. The water, calm. The voices were gone. But the fountain waited. I had been sorting through the old boxes in the attic for hours. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of old books and papers seemed to hang in every corner of the room. It was a task I had put off for years, but the thought of clearing out the clutter had finally driven me to it. The attic was where my parents had stored everything from my childhood, the old photo albums, my school projects, even the broken toys I'd forgotten about long ago. But today, as I dug deeper into one of the boxes, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a stack of letters, bound with a simple red ribbon. They were neatly folded, and the edges were slightly yellowed, the ink still legible despite the years. At first glance, they seemed like the kind of letters you would expect to find from a younger version of yourself. A collection of memories written in the innocence of childhood. But as I untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The handwriting was mine, there was no doubt about that. But the date written on the top left corner was what made my heart skip a beat. July 15th, 2024. The letter was addressed to me, in the present day. To me, the person I had become. I stared at the paper in disbelief, a feeling of unease creeping over me. How could this be? How could I have written this letter all those years ago, while I was just a child? There was no explanation for it. The date couldn't be a mistake. I could remember writing letters to my future self as a child, but they had always been vague, hopeful messages to a person I imagined would be much older and wiser by now. But this letter was different. Dear me, the letter began. I hope by the time you read this, everything is okay. Don't worry too much about what's going on right now. I know things are hard, but things will get better soon. You're strong. You'll see. I know you will. The words were comforting, in a way, but they didn't ease the growing sense of discomfort in my chest. How could I have written these words when I was just a child, when I had no way of knowing the person I had become? The handwriting was my own, but the content, it was as though my childhood self had known something I didn't. Something I wasn't supposed to know. I unfolded another letter, then another. Each one, like the first, was addressed to me now, and each one seemed to speak to the present in a way that made no sense. The letters detailed moments of my life, things that had happened recently, things that only I could know. Yet, they were written long before they ever occurred. One letter described an argument I had with my best friend, a fight that had occurred only a few weeks ago. Another mentioned a dream I had last month, a dream I had never told anyone about. The letters seemed to predict the future, as if they were written by someone who had seen my life unfold, step by step. And the more I read, the more the unease in my chest grew, until it was a tight knot in my stomach. But the worst part? The final letter. It was the one that had been written most recently, just a few months ago. The words were simple, but the message was clear. Dear me, it began. You will be alone when you read this. I don't know how or why, but I know it will happen. There will be a time when you won't be able to escape. You'll feel like you're being watched. And then, you'll find something. Something that will explain everything. I stopped reading. My hands trembled as I held the letter in my hands, and for the first time that day, I felt the weight of the attic around me. The silence was deafening. The air felt too heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I had to know more. I had to understand how this was possible. What did my childhood self know that I didn't? What was I supposed to find? I put the letters down, my mind racing. There was something in the attic. I could feel it. It wasn't just the old boxes or the forgotten memories. It was something else. Something lingering just beyond the corners of my mind, something that had been waiting for me to find these letters. And that's when I heard it. A soft, creaking sound. A door opening slowly, just behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned toward the sound. But there was nothing there. Just the shadows. And the stillness. The letters were all I had left, and they were telling me something I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The attic had never felt this cold before. The silence after the creak of the door lingered, heavy and thick. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space behind me. My breath seemed louder than ever, the steady rise and fall of my chest the only sound in the otherwise still attic. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to check, but my body refused to move. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, my senses sharp with fear. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. The air was different, like it had changed, become thicker, colder. I reached for the stack of letters again, my fingers trembling as I picked up the next one. It was written in the same neat handwriting, but this time the message was even more specific, almost too specific. Dear me, it started. By now, you've heard it. You've felt it. The presence. It's been waiting for you. Don't ignore it. Don't pretend you didn't hear it. The door. It's not just a door anymore. It's a warning. It's opening because you're supposed to see what's beyond it. But be careful. There are things you don't want to find. I gasped, reading those words again. The door. I had heard it, hadn't I? I couldn't explain it, but the creak was real. It wasn't just my imagination. The letter was speaking directly to what had just happened, warning me of something I hadn't yet fully grasped. But I knew one thing for sure now. Whatever was in that attic, whatever was waiting, it wasn't a coincidence. The letters weren't just messages from the past, they were a guide. A warning. I took a shaky step forward, my feet moving on their own despite my mind screaming at me to stop. My eyes stayed on the door that led to the dark part of the attic. I didn't remember leaving it open, but now it was wide, gaping in front of me. I turned away, clutching the letters tightly, my hands gripping the edges so hard my knuckles turned white. I had to get out of this place, but the path to the stairs seemed farther than ever. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet with every step, each one echoing louder than the last, as though the house was alive, watching me. I tried to focus, tried to block out the fear creeping up my spine, but the words from the letters wouldn't leave me. There are things you don't want to find. I couldn't stop thinking about the door. It felt like it was calling me, whispering to me in a way I couldn't understand. I needed to know, but I was terrified to find out what lay on the other side. What could be waiting for me in the darkness? Suddenly, I stopped. The air in the attic felt different, as though it had shifted. There was something moving in the shadows. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but my heart raced with the growing certainty that I was no longer alone. A soft rustling sound came from behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, eyes darting across the attic. The boxes were still there, the old furniture, but there was something else now. Something that hadn't been there before. A figure, barely visible, standing in the far corner of the attic. At first, it was only a shadow, an outline against the wall, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it clearly. A child. A small figure, no older than I had been when I wrote the letters. It was facing away from me, its back hunched, head lowered as if it were waiting. I gasped, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, frozen, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. And then, the sound came again. The door. It creaked ever so softly, as if someone, something, was pushing it open. The letters were in my hands, heavy and full of truth, but they felt almost pointless now. The answers were no longer hidden in the paper. They were in the shadows, in the figure standing motionless in the corner. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. It knew I had read the letters. It knew I had found them. And now it was waiting for me to do something about it. I forced myself to take a step forward. My legs were trembling, but I couldn't stop. There was no turning back now. As I moved closer to the shadowy figure, I felt a coldness seep into my bones. It was as if the very air had become charged with an eerie energy, thick and suffocating. My thoughts raced. Is this real? Is this happening? While I was only a few feet away, the figure slowly raised its head. And for the first time, I saw its face. It was me. But not me, not the woman I was now. It was the face of the child I had been, the one I had long forgotten, the one who had written those letters. It stared at me with hollow eyes, a gaze so deep it seemed to reach inside me, pulling something from within. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know what it was. All I could feel was a rising sense of dread, a tightness in my chest, as if I was being drawn into a place I couldn't escape. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, melting back into the shadows. I was alone again. Or so it seemed. But as I turned toward the door, something caught my eye. A small scrap of paper fluttering at my feet. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was different now. It wasn't mine. "Don't go," it said. "It's already too late." And just like that, the attic grew darker. I stood there, frozen, holding the scrap of paper in my hand. My breath quickened, and my heart pounded in my chest. The words were simple, but their weight was crushing. "Don't go." How could someone else, something else, have written this note? There was no one else in the attic. No one could have been watching me. No one could have known what I was doing, what I was feeling. Yet, the note was in my hand, the ink still fresh, the paper still warm as though it had just been written. I could feel my mind starting to unravel, threads of reality slipping through my fingers. How much of this was real? How much of it was in my head? The figure, the shadow, the coldness that had filled the room, it was all becoming too much to comprehend. The line between what was real and what was not was blurring, and I wasn't sure which side I was on anymore. I looked around the attic again, half expecting to see the shadowy figure in the corner once more, but it was gone. The room was still, and the only sound was the muffled beating of my own heart. The door, which had creaked open earlier, was now completely closed. But somehow, it felt as if it were still open, as if there was something waiting just beyond it. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But I couldn't. My feet refused to move. My mind, clouded by fear and confusion, seemed to be trapped in the attic with me. The letters, the figure, the note, there was no escaping it. Everything had led to this moment, to this place. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had started when I found those letters wasn't finished yet. I turned back to the pile of letters I had dropped earlier. They were scattered across the floor, but one in particular caught my eye. The last one, the one that had spoken of finding something that would explain everything. I hadn't read it yet. I hadn't been able to bring myself to open it. But now, with the weight of the attic pressing in on me, I knew I had no choice. I picked it up, my hand shaking as I unfolded it. The words were familiar, comforting in their simplicity, but the unease that had followed me from the moment I found the first letter still lingered, a constant reminder that something was wrong. Dear me, the letter began. I know you're scared. I know you're feeling alone. But listen carefully, because this is important. The truth is right in front of you, and you can't see it. Not yet. You won't understand until it's too late. But remember this, when you find the thing you're looking for, it will all make sense. And you will wish you had never looked. I read the words again, slower this time, my mind desperately trying to process them. The truth was right in front of me. What did that mean? What truth? What was I supposed to be looking for? I looked around the attic again, feeling the walls close in. The shadows were deeper now, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching for me. And then, a sound. A soft, barely perceptible whisper, as if the house itself was trying to speak to me. I spun around, my eyes darting across the room, but there was no one there. Nothing moved. Only the silence. But the whispering grew louder, insistent. It was a voice, not my own. A voice I couldn't place, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was telling me something. Something I didn't want to hear. It's here. It's waiting for you. The coldness in the room intensified, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The voice was becoming clearer now, more distinct, as if someone were standing just behind me, whispering in my ear. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I was alone. And yet, I wasn't. The whispering continued, and this time it was accompanied by a soft creaking sound. The door that had been closed. It was opening again, slowly, as though something, or someone, was stepping through. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence, and I felt a chill wash over me. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate. They were coming toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The presence was there, just beyond the threshold, and I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't something I could escape. It had been waiting for me all along. The truth. I didn't understand what it meant at first, but now, as I stared at the door, I realized the truth was not something I could run from. It wasn't just hidden in the letters or the shadows. It was waiting for me in the very place I had tried to avoid. The attic wasn't just a room in my house. It was a prison, a place where the past and the present collided, a place where something had been trapped, waiting for me to uncover it. And now, I had no choice but to face it. The door creaked open fully, and I took one final, trembling step toward it. There, in the doorway, was the figure once more. But this time, it wasn't a shadow. It was real. A child's figure, with eyes that burned with an eerie familiarity. And in its hands, it held a letter. My letter. Time to read the last one, it whispered. I reached for the letter, but my hands trembled so much I almost couldn't grasp it. I unfolded it slowly, fear coursing through me. And then I read the words, the final words that would explain everything. Dear me, the door is open now. You know what you must do. It is time to come home. I froze. The words didn't make sense. Home? This wasn't home. This wasn't even real. The attic, my past, was waiting. But was I ready to find out what had been waiting for me all this time? I stood there, my hand trembling as I held the letter in front of me, the words still echoing in my mind, "It is time to come home." The voice behind me, the voice of the child, whispered again, the sound like ice scraping against bone. Come home, it said softly, almost lovingly. It's been waiting. But home? What did that mean? My real home, the place I had grown up? No, that couldn't be it. This attic, this house, it wasn't home. It wasn't real. None of it made sense. I glanced over at the doorway. The child's figure still stood there, unmoving, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The darkness in the attic seemed to close in on me, suffocating and heavy. The door was wide open now, inviting me to step forward, to cross into whatever was waiting beyond. But every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out, to escape. But then, I thought of the letters. The strange, cryptic letters that had led me here. The messages I couldn't ignore. They had been written by someone who knew everything, someone who had been me, but not the me I was now. Someone who had lived this, who had been trapped in the same place I found myself. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. The truth was in the letters. It had to be. But the truth was also in the child standing before me, its cold eyes piercing through my soul. Why are you here? I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. My voice cracked, and I hated how weak I sounded. What do you want from me? The figure didn't respond, but I saw its head tilt ever so slightly, as though considering the question. Then, without warning, it took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate. With each step, the shadows in the attic deepened, spreading out from the figure, making the room feel even more claustrophobic, as though the walls were closing in around me. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. The house was alive with sound now, the creaking of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind outside, the sound of my own heart hammering in my chest. Everything seemed to be vibrating with a strange, unnatural energy. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts raced, spiraling out of control. The letters. The figure. The door. The child. Was I losing my mind? Had I already lost it? I didn't know what was real anymore. The figure stepped closer. I could feel its coldness now, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I tried to take a step back, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in this nightmare. Come home, the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, choked with fear. The child reached out a hand, its fingers long and pale, almost translucent in the dim light. It was so close now, I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and rancid, like it had been waiting for centuries. It touched my arm. The moment it made contact, I felt a jolt of icy electricity shoot through my body. My skin burned where it touched, and I gasped in pain, but I couldn't pull away. The child's grip was like iron, unyielding, and it felt as though the very essence of me was being drained, pulled out through my skin. The attic around me began to shift, the walls warping, the air thickening. I saw flashes of images, fragments of my past, my childhood. But they weren't memories. They were images of things I hadn't experienced yet, things that felt like they were happening in another lifetime. A place I had forgotten. A place I had left behind. Come home. The voice echoed again, now louder than ever, as though it was coming from every corner of the room, surrounding me. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't make sense of anything. The shadows seemed to move, twisting, growing, forming shapes. Faces, hands, eyes, things I couldn't comprehend, things I didn't want to see. The child's voice cut through the chaos, more demanding now. You've always known the way. It's time to remember. I closed my eyes, my head spinning. The letters. The warning. The truth. The door. Something inside me snapped. I reached out, finally breaking free of the child's grip. My hand trembled as I took the first step forward. My feet moved on their own, as if guided by some unseen force. The door was open, and beyond it, beyond that threshold, lay whatever truth had been hidden from me for so long. I crossed the threshold. And suddenly, I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was in a place that felt wrong. The walls were the same, but everything was twisted, distorted. The air was thick, heavy, like it was suffocating me. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. And then, I saw it. The same child. The same figure. Only this time, it was not standing in the corner. It was sitting at a table, writing. The same letters. The same handwriting. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The child looked up, and I saw that it wasn't a child at all. It was me. A version of me I had forgotten. A version of me I had lost. And then I understood. The truth. I was never meant to escape. I was never meant to leave. This was my home. This was where I had always been. The attic, the letters, the door, they weren't warnings. They were a cycle, a loop I had been trapped in, one that had begun long before I could remember. The door closed behind me with a final, resounding thud. And I realized there was no way out. There never had been. The letters were just the beginning. It was time to stay. Time to remember. Time to come home. And this time, I wasn't leaving. The room, the space I found myself in now, had a sickening familiarity, like the moment when you wake up from a dream and realize it's already too late. The walls were the same as in the attic, but now they felt suffocating. The air was thick, pressing in from all sides, heavy with memories I couldn't quite place. The house, my house, had never felt so foreign, so wrong. I turned back to look at the door. The space I had crossed into was not an attic anymore, not a room of the house I knew. It was something worse, something deeper. And behind me, the figure, the child, had disappeared. In its place, an envelope sat on a small wooden table in the center of the room. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I did. I had to open it. My hands, still trembling from everything I had just experienced, moved without hesitation. The envelope was familiar. It looked exactly like the ones I had found earlier, the ones I had read in the attic. The ones that had led me here. I sat down at the table, my heart beating too fast as I slowly pulled the letter from the envelope. The paper was old, worn, but the writing was unmistakable. It was mine. But it was not the me I knew now, it was the me from before, from when I had been a child. Dear me, the letter began, and I felt a chill ripple through my body. You don't remember, but you will. You must. This house, this place, it was never meant to be your escape. You cannot leave. You cannot run from what you've always known. I stopped reading. The words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though I was reading something I had forgotten, something that I had been too afraid to face. But now it was here. It was back. I kept reading, even though I didn't want to. You think you're trapped, the letter continued. But you were always here. You are part of this house. This house is part of you. The door is not the way out. It's the way in. The door that you thought would lead you to freedom, to an end, is just the beginning. You'll see soon enough. The words blurred in front of my eyes as I read, the weight of them pressing into my chest like a physical force. You are part of this house. The door is just the beginning. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about finding out the truth. This wasn't about unlocking memories from my past. The truth I was meant to uncover was something far darker, something more terrifying. It was about who I was, what I had become, and what I had always been. I slammed the letter down onto the table, my mind racing. I'm not trapped, I thought. I'm not trapped. This isn't real. I'm not part of this place. But something deep inside me knew it was. Something I couldn't escape. The shadows in the room grew longer, stretching across the walls, creeping toward me. The cold that had been creeping up my spine was now unbearable, as though I was surrounded by an ice-cold wind. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, filling the room like a storm. The air vibrated with them, each word sinking into my skin, into my bones. Come home. You've always been here. It's time to remember. The figure returned, stepping out from the shadows. It wasn't the child anymore. It was me. A version of me I didn't recognize. It was my face, but distorted. Twisted. The eyes, my eyes, were empty, hollow, staring at me like they had seen everything. Like they had already been here. Do you understand now? The figure asked, its voice cold, like it was speaking from far away. I nodded, but the words stuck in my throat. I was shaking, unable to breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't break free. The figure smiled, and it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a knowing smile, a smile of someone who had always known the truth, someone who had never doubted it. It's time, it said simply. The room seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the soft whisper of the wind outside. But it wasn't real. The house wasn't real. The figure wasn't real. None of it was real. And yet, the feeling in my chest told me something different. Something that terrified me. I had never left. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the oppressive weight of the room, the figure, the whispers. But when I opened them again, I wasn't in the room anymore. I was back in the attic. Everything was the same, and yet everything had changed. The letters, scattered across the floor, now looked different, older, more worn. The air felt thick, suffocating. The whispers, the presence, they had never left. They were always here. I looked around in a panic. The door, the one that had once been a way out, was still there, but it was no longer a door at all. It was an endless black void, an abyss that I couldn't escape. And then, in the center of the room, I saw it. The final letter, the one I had written to myself all those years ago. I had never escaped. I had always been here. I had always been a part of this house. I picked up the letter, my hand shaking, and read the final words. Dear me, it is time to come home. And I understood. There was no escape. There never had been. The cycle was complete. And I was home. Greeting on the Call. Chapter 1, The Unexpected Message. It started with a simple thing. Something I brushed off at first, thinking it was a mistake or some glitch on my phone. But looking back, I can't help but feel it was the moment everything changed. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through messages and sipping my coffee when my phone buzzed. A call. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but that wasn't unusual. Sometimes, telemarketers or automated systems would call. I glanced at the screen, not thinking much of it, and hit the green button. "Hello?" I said, in my usual way. A strange silence greeted me. I frowned, holding the phone closer to my ear. The connection seemed off, crackling a little, and then I heard it. The sound of someone breathing softly. Not a breath of a person on the other end, but something heavier. I cleared my throat. "Hello? Who is this?" My voice felt uncertain, but I convinced myself it was just a bad connection. Then, a voice, unmistakably my own, echoed through the speaker. "Hello, it's nice to meet you again," the voice said, with a slight pause before it continued. "I've been waiting for this call." I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen. The call was still active, but there was no number displayed. Just the word unknown in big bold letters. "Who is this?" I asked again, my hand starting to tremble. Instead of a response, the voice on the other end chuckled softly, and then the line went dead. The call ended abruptly. I sat frozen for a few moments, staring at my phone. My own voice. That was impossible. I didn't recognize the words or the tone. I looked down at the screen, intending to check the call history, but when I did, something else caught my attention. The greeting on my phone had changed. It wasn't the standard "Hello, you've reached my name's" voicemail message I had recorded years ago. No, this time, the message was different. "Hello, it's nice to meet you again. I've been waiting for this call." The same exact words the strange voice had spoken. I blinked, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. I hadn't made any changes to my voicemail in months. I had barely even thought about it since setting it years ago. Yet, somehow, it had changed. And it had changed to words I never said. A cold dread gripped my chest. I was alone in my apartment. Nobody else had access to my phone. No one could have edited that message without my knowledge. But there it was, clear as day. A message I didn't recognize. A message that felt wrong. Was this some sort of prank? My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone again and listened to the message. The words were unnerving, yes, but it wasn't just the words that disturbed me. It was the voice. It sounded off, slightly distorted, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. A voice that was mine, but wasn't mine. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Should I check for signs of someone tampering with my phone? But nothing felt normal anymore. Nothing felt safe. And then, just as I was about to set the phone down, it buzzed again. Another call. This time, the number on the screen was one I recognized, my own. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, unable to comprehend what was happening. I answered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" "Hello," the voice on the other end responded, and again, it was unmistakably mine. But this time, it sounded different. It was slower, more deliberate, like the voice I had heard before. "I told you," it said. "I've been waiting. And now, it's your turn." I felt my blood run cold. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. My own voice, from my own phone, speaking in ways I hadn't spoken. What did this mean? Why was this happening? Who was on the other side of the line? And why did it feel like they were controlling me? The call ended abruptly once more, leaving me in stunned silence. I stared at the phone in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something had changed, and I didn't know if I could stop it. I needed answers. I needed to figure out what was going on. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't ready for what was coming next. The phone buzzed again. It was a quiet evening. The kind that makes you forget about time, where the minutes seem to drift into one another, unnoticed. I was sitting on the couch, my phone resting beside me. The living room was dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner, and the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that broke the silence. Outside, the streetlights flickered faintly through the blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. I checked my phone for the umpteenth time. No new messages, no missed calls. Just the usual notifications, an email, a reminder about a meeting tomorrow, a social media update. I was about to put the phone back down when it rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. I pressed the green button to answer. "Hello?" I said, lifting the phone to my ear. The voice on the other end wasn't familiar. "Hello?" I repeated, a little more cautiously this time. But there was no reply. Only static, a faint crackling sound. Then, a soft click and a voice. "Hello, Alex. I hope you're doing well today." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't just unfamiliar, it was wrong. It wasn't the voice of someone I knew, but it sounded as though it was speaking directly to me, with the kind of casual familiarity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the screen, but the number was still listed as unknown. My finger hovered over the red button to end the call, but before I could tap it, the voice continued. "Do you remember that place? The one you used to go to? It's been a long time since we last spoke." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea what the voice was talking about. No idea who it was, or how they knew my name, or any of those personal details. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The voice paused, as though it was considering my question. "Does it matter?" it asked in a low, almost teasing tone. "You'll remember soon enough." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I opened my mouth to say something else, but before I could, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind racing. I hadn't recognized the voice, and yet there was something eerily familiar about it. Something that lingered in the air, even after the call had ended. I sat there for a few moments, my fingers still gripping the phone. I should have felt relieved that the call was over, but instead, there was an unsettling feeling building inside me. The voice had known my name. It had known something personal, something I couldn't quite place. I checked the recent call log to see if anything had been recorded, but there was nothing. No sign of the call I had just received. The unknown number wasn't there either. It was as if the call had never happened at all. Confused and unsettled, I placed my phone back down on the coffee table. I leaned back into the couch, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It was just a prank, I told myself. Someone playing a joke. It's nothing to worry about. But even as I said that, I couldn't help but wonder who would know about that place. The one I used to visit. The one I hadn't thought about in years. I looked over at the phone again. The screen was dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was different. I unlocked it again, hoping to get some comfort in the normalcy of scrolling through my messages. But when the screen lit up, I froze. The wallpaper had changed. It wasn't the photo of a sunset that I'd set months ago. It was a picture of a street I didn't recognize, but one that looked almost like the one I had lived on when I was younger. The street I used to walk down to that place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again, and this time I didn't try to shake it off. Something had happened. Something was happening. I tapped the home button to exit the screen, but when I opened the dialer, there was something else. Something even stranger. The greeting on the voicemail had changed. It was no longer the simple, automated greeting I had recorded years ago. It was a voice. A voice that sounded far too familiar, but it wasn't mine. "Hey, it's Alex. I'm not available right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you." It was almost word for word what I had said on my old greeting, but it wasn't me speaking. It was the same voice from the phone call. I stared at the phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I scrolled through the settings. There had to be some explanation. Some kind of glitch, some way the settings had been altered without my permission. But when I tried to change the voicemail greeting back to the one I had recorded, it wouldn't let me. The option to update the greeting was grayed out, and the phone froze as I tapped it repeatedly. A cold sweat began to form on my forehead. I was alone in the apartment. Just me. But something was there. Something I couldn't see, but could feel. And the worst part? I wasn't sure anymore if the voice on the phone had ever been a prank at all. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. The apartment, which had once felt like a familiar and safe haven, now felt hollow, unnerving, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I sat frozen, staring at the phone, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. I had no explanation for the strange voicemail greeting, nor for the voice that had spoken to me earlier. The room felt stifling, the air thick with an unspoken tension. I looked around at the corners of the apartment, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the only movement was the slow swing of the ceiling fan. My hands clenched tightly around the phone, still gripped with the unsettling realization that I had no control over what was happening. I stood up from the couch, pacing back and forth. It was getting late, and the familiar sounds of the city outside, the honking of horns, the murmur of people passing by, seemed muffled, distant, as though the world had grown quieter. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the occasional buzz of my phone vibrating in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. Another unknown number. The same feeling of dread crept up my spine as I stared at the incoming call, and this time I didn't hesitate. I swiped to answer. "Hello?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, trembling slightly, but I tried to steady myself. There was a moment of silence, and then a voice, calm and familiar, but wrong. "Hello, Alex? I see you're still trying to figure this out." My heart skipped a beat. The voice again. It was as though it knew exactly what I was thinking, what I was feeling. There was no doubt now, this was no coincidence. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end let out a soft chuckle, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "I'm someone you'll never forget. Someone who's been watching." My stomach twisted. I wanted to hang up, but my hand froze over the red button. What if there was something more I needed to hear? "What do you want from me?" I demanded, the words coming out in a rush. The voice was quiet for a moment, as if considering my question. Then it replied with an eerie calmness. Nothing. Not yet, anyway. But you'll come to understand soon enough. There are things you've forgotten, Alex. Things you've locked away. And I'm here to remind you. A shiver ran down my spine. The voice was right. There were things I had forgotten. Things buried deep in the recesses of my mind, like a hidden door that I was too afraid to open. The call ended abruptly, and once again, I was left in the suffocating silence of the apartment. The screen on my phone flashed, and my breath caught in my throat. The voicemail greeting had changed again. It was no longer the strange voice that had spoken to me earlier. This time, it was my own voice. Hey, it's Alex. I'm not available right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you. But something was off. It wasn't the way I remembered it. The words were slower, more deliberate. As though I was speaking through a haze, as if something was controlling my movements, my actions. Something that wasn't me. I scrambled to change the voicemail greeting, but once again, I was met with the same result. The option to update the greeting was unavailable. My phone was locked in place, and no matter what I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was no longer mine. That it was part of whatever was controlling this strange situation. I tossed the phone onto the couch in frustration, my mind racing. The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in on me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of true isolation. No one was here with me. No one could help me. Whatever this was, it was happening to me, and I had no way to stop it. I glanced out the window, my eyes searching the dark street below. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. But it was the quiet that unsettled me the most. The absence of life, the stillness that had overtaken the world outside. It was as though time itself had come to a halt. And then, just as I thought I might be able to calm myself, the phone buzzed again. Another call. Another unknown number. I stared at the screen for a long moment. My fingers twitched, but I didn't reach for the phone. This time, I didn't want to answer. I couldn't. But the phone kept ringing. The buzzing sound grew louder, more insistent. It was like it was calling me, beckoning me to pick up, as though something on the other side was waiting for me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. With a trembling hand, I swiped to answer the call. "Hello?" I said, my voice a whisper, barely audible. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, like the air before a storm. And then, the voice returned. But this time, it wasn't speaking to me directly. Instead, I heard a sound, a soft whisper, like a distant murmur. A conversation. Two voices, speaking over one another. "I told you it would work," a man's voice said. "Yes, but she doesn't remember." "She won't understand," another voice responded, this one lower, almost a growl. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't recognize either of the voices. And I certainly didn't know what they were talking about. "What's happening?" I managed to force out, my voice shaking. But the voices didn't answer. They just kept speaking, overlapping each other. Their words were impossible to make out, but one thing was clear, they were discussing me. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that I was no longer in control of this situation. This wasn't just a prank. This wasn't just a glitch in my phone. I had been drawn into something much darker. something I wasn't ready to face. I dropped the phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The voices continued to echo in my head, their words an indistinguishable buzz, but the sensation of being watched, of being known, remained. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a prank. This was something much darker. Something beyond the limits of technology. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone in this apartment. The walls had started to feel too thin, too fragile, as if they couldn't protect me anymore. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, staring at the phone on the couch. It was almost as if it was daring me to pick it up again, to answer the call and face whatever lay on the other end. But I couldn't. I had no idea who or what these voices were, and every instinct screamed in me to stay away from that device. But as the silence stretched on, I realized something. My fear of the unknown was just as paralyzing as the voices themselves. If I didn't act, I'd be trapped in this cycle, forever consumed by the mystery that had already taken root in my mind. I took a deep breath and reached for the phone. The screen flashed, and to my horror, it was a new voicemail notification. Another recording. My pulse quickened. I didn't need to listen to it. I already knew what it would say. The voices had spoken to me, and they were real. This wasn't just some trick. My thoughts were no longer my own. But still, I couldn't help myself. I pressed play. This time, I wasn't met with the usual static of a voicemail greeting. No, this was different. The voices were clearer now, sharp, deliberate, their words almost tangible. "Do you hear us now, Alex?" a man's voice asked, his tone smooth, cold. "We've been waiting for you." A shiver crawled down my spine as I listened, feeling the weight of his words settle like lead in my chest. "We've watched you, studied you. You think you've been living your life freely, don't you?" The voice was mocking now, as if it had already seen my every move. "But everything you've done, every choice you've made, we were there." The phone slipped from my hand, falling to the floor with a dull thud. I couldn't breathe. How could they know so much? How could they be there? A soft click echoed through the room, followed by a cold, mechanical voice, one I recognized all too well. "You've activated the system," the voice stated matter-of-factly, as if it were reading from a manual. "The protocol has begun. There's no turning back now." A wave of nausea hit me. The words felt like they were imprinted directly into my mind. The protocol? What protocol? I stumbled back into the living room, my legs unsteady as I scanned the apartment, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain this madness. But there was nothing. The room remained the same. The light from the street lamp outside still spilled through the blinds, casting shadows across the floor. It was as if the world outside had continued, untouched, while my reality worked around me. I needed to figure this out. I had to understand what was happening before it was too late. The phone, it was the key, wasn't it? The connection. But how was it possible that something so simple could hold so much power? I couldn't remember ever setting up a voicemail like this. And yet, the voice on the recording had been mine, my own words. But they weren't my words. I reached for the phone again, driven by a mixture of fear and an odd need to understand. The screen flashed once more, and the next voicemail began without me touching a single button. It was the same voice, but this time it was more insistent, more personal. "You think this is just a glitch, don't you? But you were always going to be part of this, Alex. You were chosen. We made sure of that. I felt my breath catch. Chosen? The system is watching, listening, waiting. Your every move is accounted for. The next step is already in motion. Can you feel it? The voice sounded almost pleased now, as though it were savoring the fear it was stirring in me. No. I whispered to myself, my hands trembling violently. I could feel the room closing in again. The walls were pressing in on me, the air thick and heavy. The phone screen flickered, and the familiar unavailable message appeared. But before I could even comprehend what was happening, the screen shifted. It displayed a number I didn't recognize, long digits, foreign, impossible to trace. The name that appeared next to it made my blood run cold. No contact name. I hadn't saved that number. I hadn't done anything. I should have hung up. I should have just turned off the phone and ignored it all, but something deep within me refused to let go. Something told me that if I didn't confront this, I would be swallowed whole by it. I answered the call. This time, there was no greeting. Just silence. A deep, almost suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The kind of silence that was far worse than any noise could ever be. The air itself felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. Then, in the silence, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate. It wasn't mine. I turned, my heart racing, and the voice whispered, barely audible, in my ear. I told you, Alex. We've been watching you. We're always watching. Before I could react, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, the weight of the words settling over me like a dark cloud. What was I supposed to do now? How was I supposed to escape from this invisible force that seemed to be controlling everything? The room had become unnaturally quiet. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I was alone at all. There was a knock at the door. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that everything I had just heard was only the beginning. The knock echoed again, louder this time, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I hadn't heard anyone approach the apartment. There was no way anyone was here. No one had come to visit me, not for months. The knock was rhythmic, deliberate, like it was part of a pattern, part of something I couldn't yet understand. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it, that I had finally lost my grip on reality. But no! The knock was real. And whatever it was, whoever it was standing on the other side of that door, waiting. I slowly moved towards the hallway, my legs trembling beneath me. The apartment felt colder now, the silence thicker, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. Every step I took toward the door seemed to echo through the apartment, each footfall heavier than the last. I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushing against the cool metal, and for a moment I hesitated. What was I about to face? Would it be worse than the phone call? Worse than the voices that had been invading my mind, taking over my thoughts, my actions? The thought of not opening the door was tempting. But then, I remembered the words on the voicemail, the cold, mocking voice telling me I was part of something, telling me I was being watched. I opened the door. At first, all I saw was the empty hallway, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering light. No one stood there. No one at all. The air felt thick with tension, like something was hiding just out of sight. My chest tightened. Was this part of the game? The voices on the phone had warned me, had prepared me for this. I stepped into the hallway, my breath catching in my throat. I had to check. I had to be sure. As I walked down the corridor, the lights flickered again, casting long shadows on the walls. The place felt empty, desolate. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The door to the stairwell was slightly ajar, creaking open as if inviting me to step inside. But it wasn't the stairwell that caught my attention, it was the faint sound of something, or someone, moving just beyond my reach. The sound was soft at first, almost like breathing, like someone was just behind me, following me, waiting for me to turn around. I spun on my heels, but there was nothing. No one. I felt dizzy, my mind clouded with panic. Was this all a trick? Was I being lured into a trap? Or had I truly crossed some threshold, some point of no return? The phone in my pocket buzzed, a sharp vibration that made me jump. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled it out with shaking hands. The screen flashed, and there it was again, another voicemail notification. I couldn't do it. Not again. But the fear that gripped me was stronger than my will to ignore it. I pressed play. The same cold, mocking voice filled my ears, but this time it wasn't just the voice that unsettled me. It was the way it spoke, the way it knew me. "You're getting closer," it whispered. "You're almost there, Alex. We've made sure of it." I backed away, my eyes darting nervously down the hallway. The sound of the voice seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if it were moving closer, as if the source of the voice was now standing behind me, waiting to touch me. "Don't turn around," it said, the voice suddenly dropping to a low, sinister whisper. "We're already in the room with you." I felt the blood drain from my face. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned, faster than I ever thought I could. There was nothing. But the sense of presence, that feeling that I was not alone, was overwhelming. Suddenly, a sharp knock came from behind me. The sound was so close, so immediate, that I spun around in terror. My breath hitched as I searched the empty hallway again. There was no one. No one at all. I felt the phone slip from my hand. It crashed to the ground with a sickening crack, but I barely noticed. I was already backing away from the door, from the hallway, from the source of the knock. I wasn't just hearing the voices anymore. They were in my head, in my thoughts, guiding me, controlling me. They were everywhere. They knew everything. I turned and ran back into the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, my hands pressed against the wood, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment was still. Too still. The lights flickered again, and I felt the temperature drop, as if the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't want to look. I didn't want to hear what was on the other side of the call. But I knew I couldn't escape it. I picked up the phone. There was no voicemail this time. Just a single, chilling sentence that was more terrifying than anything else I had heard. "We're already inside your head, Alex. You can't hide from us anymore." And in that moment, I realized with horror that I had never been alone in the apartment. The voices, the presence, had always been here. It wasn't a glitch. It was real. The real nightmare was only just beginning, and I had no idea how to escape. I slammed the phone down onto the counter, feeling a wave of panic flood over me. The words echoed in my ears, the voice of that thing inside my head, the one who knew more about me than I did. The reality was beginning to twist, to warp. Nothing felt safe. Not the apartment, not the hallway, not even the air I was breathing. I couldn't sit still. The walls were too close. The floor too solid. The windows trapped. Every corner of the apartment now felt like a cage, closing in on me, constricting with each passing second. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. The voices in my head had always been subtle at first, distant whispers in the phone, little things, like someone just out of sight. But now they were a presence. A force. They had crossed a line. I grabbed my jacket, my hand shaking violently as I tugged it on. My heart thumped so hard it felt like it was going to rip through my chest. The door. I had to get to the door. I rushed toward it, my body moving on instinct, as if my limbs had somehow disconnected from my mind. The closer I got to the exit, the louder the voices grew, no longer whispers, but clear, distinct words, like they were standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. "You can't leave, Alex." The words froze me mid-step. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But that voice, pulled me in, paralyzing me with fear. "You can't hide from us. We know where you're going." I could hear the echo of the voice, the way it seemed to bounce off the walls, like it was coming from all directions. It was inside me. It was in my skin, in my bones. I could feel it crawling under my flesh. "Turn around." The voice was commanding now. Cold. Authoritative. I couldn't fight it. My body was moving without my consent, as if the very air was drawing me back. I slowly turned around. The apartment was empty. Still. Too still. But something had changed. The air was heavier, thicker. The walls seemed to close in on me, the floor sinking beneath my feet as I stood in the middle of the room. The silence was suffocating, but then it shattered. A crash. A sound from the bedroom. It was loud, sharp, and it made my heart skip a beat. I spun toward the noise, my body freezing as my mind raced. There was no one in the room. No intruder. No figure in the shadows. Just the faint smell of dust and wood. And the phone. The phone I had thrown across the room earlier, it was ringing again. It was the same number. The one that had been calling all night. The one I had ignored. The one that was now making its presence known. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I picked it up, slowly. I didn't want to answer. I was terrified of what would come next. But I couldn't stop myself. I pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello?" It was silence at first. Then the voice came, that cold, unyielding voice. "You can't escape, Alex." It wasn't the voice from the call anymore. It was my voice. My own voice, echoing back at me through the phone. "You've already made your choice." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone, but I was frozen, unable to move. It was as if I was being held in place by some invisible force. "You've invited us in, Alex," the voice continued, the words slithering into my mind like poison. "You're already one of us. You belong to us now." I could feel the blood draining from my face. The walls of the apartment were closing in again. I turned frantically, searching for something, anything, that could explain this. But there was nothing. No sign of anything out of place. Just the phone. The phone and the voice. "You can't escape us. We are you." My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices were too loud now, too real. They were everywhere. I crawled toward the door, but as my fingers touched the handle, a voice from behind me whispered again, sending a chill down my spine. "We are always with you, Alex. You will never leave." I opened the door, and the hallway stretched on forever. There was no escape. I stepped into the corridor, the air thick with the oppressive weight of the voices that followed me, the pulse of them vibrating in my skull. The hallway wasn't the same. The walls were closer, the shadows darker, as if the space itself had changed to reflect the presence that now controlled me. I heard it. A low murmur that began to grow louder, the sound of footsteps, indistinct at first, but then clear, too clear, moving in sync with mine. I turned, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. No one. Just the endless echo of my own footsteps and the insistent pounding of my heart. I looked down the corridor. The walls were stretching, and I could feel the air growing colder, heavier, suffocating. The floor beneath my feet began to shift, the boards creaking, groaning as if they were alive, as if they were part of the trap that was closing around me. Then, the phone rang again. The screen flashed. And this time, there was no question. It wasn't a call. It was a warning. They were here. And there was no way out. The last passenger of the train. Chapter 1, The Empty Carriage. It was late. Too late, really. The kind of late when the world feels still, almost forgotten. The train rattled along the tracks, an endless hum that seemed to blur the line between waking and dreaming. I had boarded at a quiet station with only a few passengers, but as the train sped through the dark, they all seemed to disappear, leaving me in a carriage that felt far too big for just one person. I glanced out the window. The night outside was thick with fog, the kind that swallowed everything whole, like the world had decided to forget itself. The station lights blinked past, casting short flashes of light that flickered across the seat cushions, only to vanish in the next instant. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and settled into my seat, trying to shake off the unease that had crept in. The quiet was unnerving. In the silence, every sound felt amplified, the creaking of the train, the soft click of the rails beneath, the low whistling wind that seemed to seep in from the cracks of the windows. The lights in the carriage flickered once, twice. I felt a shiver run through me, but I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the old train. It had been running for years, after all. Nothing to be afraid of. But then I noticed it. A shape. A shadow. It was at the far end of the carriage, sitting in one of the seats, barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. After all, the train had that effect on you, especially when you were alone at this hour. But as I stared, I realized there was someone there. A figure, hunched over, their face hidden in the darkness, sitting perfectly still. I blinked. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard them enter. There had been no footsteps, no sign of movement. Just suddenly, someone was there. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the strange sense of dread building in my chest. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little too loud in the quiet. "Are you all right?" No response. Not even the faintest shift in position. The person was motionless, as if they were part of the train itself, as though they had always been there. I felt my palms begin to sweat. It was stupid, I told myself. Of course, Someone else had to be on the train. But then why did it feel so wrong? Why did it feel like there was something off about that figure? I glanced around the empty carriage again. No one else. Just me and the silent person at the far end. I tried to ignore them, pretending to be absorbed in my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that their presence was too quiet, too still. It was as if they weren't human at all, just a dark stain in the corner of my vision. Then I heard something. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from their direction. A sigh. Or perhaps a rustle, the movement of fabric. I wasn't sure. But it felt wrong. The train was still, and yet the air felt heavy with something I couldn't explain. My fingers tightened around my phone, the device warm against my skin as I stared at the shadowed figure. Every fiber of my being screamed to look away, to pretend I hadn't noticed them. But I couldn't. I was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, my eyes unable to break away from the shape in the darkness. It didn't move, but the air seemed to change. It felt colder, even though the heating in the carriage was working fine. And then, I thought I saw something. Just for a second. A glimpse of pale skin, a hand reaching out from the shadows. I froze. Was it reaching for me? The train clicked over the tracks, and the sound broke the spell for a moment. The figures slumped further down into their seat, disappearing again into the darkness, but the unsettling sensation lingered, clinging to the space between us. I stared at the dark end of the carriage, my heart beating faster, my mind racing. Why wasn't the person answering me? Why wasn't anyone else on the train? I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just a weird feeling. A bad instinct. But the more I sat there, the more that feeling of wrongness grew. Something was happening, something I didn't understand, and I could feel the tension in the air, building like a pressure that would explode any second. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But the train didn't stop. It kept moving forward, through the empty, fog-shrouded night, deeper into a place I couldn't escape. The figure in the darkness remained still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for something. I closed my eyes, tried to breathe steadily, but when I opened them again, the figure was gone. I blinked, feeling a cold sweat break out across my back. There was no sign of them. The seat was empty. The air in the carriage seemed to settle back into its usual hum, as though nothing had ever happened. But something inside me had changed. The quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being watched, it had all deepened into a cold, unnerving truth. I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something had been there. Something that shouldn't have been. The train rattled on. And then, I saw the station lights. We were nearing the stop. I had no idea where I was, but the lights outside the window illuminated a new station, deserted, dark, like it had been waiting for us. The train slowed as we approached. The doors of the carriage began to hiss open. And then, as the train came to a halt, I heard a sound from behind me, the softest shuffle of feet. The figure. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The doors opened, and the eerie silence of the empty platform spread into the carriage. I was alone. Or was I? The doors of the train opened, and the chilly night air rushed in, sweeping through the carriage. I was still trying to process what had just happened. The figure. The absence. My mind raced to make sense of it all. Had I imagined it? Had it been some trick of the light or my tired mind? but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I glanced nervously around the carriage, half expecting to see the figure standing there again, lurking in the shadows. But the seat was empty. The same empty seat I had stared at earlier, now completely vacant. There was no sign of anyone. I took a slow, deliberate breath and looked at the platform outside. The station was almost ghostly in its emptiness, with a few dim lights hanging from posts casting long, distorted shadows across the tracks. The fog had thickened outside, and the air smelled of dampness, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The silence was unnerving. I felt a strange, gnawing need to leave the train. I couldn't stay here, not after what I had seen or hadn't seen. My hand instinctively reached for my bag as if to grab my belongings and get out of this forsaken place. But just as I made a move to step toward the door, the train jerked forward again, and the hiss of the closing doors startled me. The platform was already far behind us. The lights of the station, which had been so close just a moment ago, were now distant and fading. A cold wave of confusion and dread washed over me. I hadn't heard the conductor's announcement. I hadn't felt the train move. How had the doors closed so suddenly? I turned my head, eyes scanning the carriage again, but it was still empty. The only noise came from the clattering wheels on the tracks. Everything seemed too quiet. My pulse quickened as I glanced over my shoulder. I felt something wrong, staring back at me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being watched again. I turned sharply. No one. Just the empty rows of seats and the dim lights above. But still, a sense of being watched lingered, creeping up my spine. And then, my phone buzzed. I flinched, startled by the unexpected sound in the silence. My hand reached instinctively to check it, but as soon as I saw the screen, my heart skipped a beat. The notification wasn't from any app one recognized. It was a voicemail. I frowned. The voicemail appeared to have been left just moments ago, while I was still on the train. But how? Who had left it? I hadn't heard my phone ring, and I certainly hadn't seen any indication of a new message. I pressed play, hesitant. The voice that came through the speaker wasn't mine. It was soft, almost distant, like someone speaking from the other side of the world. "Are you still there?" "Are you sure?" the voice asked, a peculiar, unhurried tone that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. I recognized the voice, or at least I thought I did. It sounded like mine, but slightly different, distant and hollow, as though it had been stretched thin across time and space. I felt an unsettling jolt of recognition, but at the same time, I didn't understand. It continued. "You're not going to like what's coming, are you? Don't say I didn't warn you." I froze. My hand dropped the phone, the device clattering softly against the seat. The voice was chilling, like a distant echo of my own thoughts, but it carried a warning I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. I scrambled to pick it up, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to play it again. I had to hear it again, try to make sense of it. But when I reached for the screen, it was gone. The voicemail was no longer there. It had disappeared. I checked my call log, but there was no trace of the message anywhere. It was as if it had never existed. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The empty carriage, the disappearance of the passenger, the eerie voice in my phone, it all felt like some twisted dream. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky beneath me. I needed to do something, anything, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The train kept its rhythmic journey, the monotonous sound of wheels against tracks the only constant. I turned to the window again. The fog outside was thicker now, the world beyond the glass blurred into an indistinct haze. The night had grown darker, and the station lights had become fewer. I could barely make out the outlines of trees, their branches swaying like dark fingers reaching into the void. Then, just as I was about to sit back down, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible. But there, moving from the far end of the carriage. I whipped my head around, my eyes scanning the length of the train. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen, waiting for any sign of movement. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow darting across the far aisle. It was the figure. The one I had seen earlier. I tried to run to the door, but my legs felt like lead. I was trapped. The figure was moving closer, its shape dark against the backdrop of the dimly lit train. The footsteps were louder now, drawing nearer with every passing second. I could see the vague outline of a person emerging from the shadows, its movement slow, deliberate. I turned toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. And now was when the figure spoke. "You should have gotten off when you had the chance." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable now. It was the same eerie tone from the voicemail, the same unsettling quality that seemed to echo around me. But now, it was real. It wasn't coming from my phone, it was coming from the figure itself. I backed up slowly, my eyes locked on the shadowy form. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. My breath was shallow, ragged, and my palms began to sweat. The figure didn't move. It remained still, just standing there in the half-light. Its form was indistinct, like a smudge in the dark. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. There was no escape. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as though considering my question. The silence stretched, growing heavy, before the shadow finally took a step forward. Just one. But it felt like 100. I instinctively reached for my phone, trying to find any way to call for help, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't focus. I pressed the wrong buttons, my mind spiraling as I failed to unlock the screen. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to gasp. The figure moved again, closer this time, its steps barely audible against the hum of the train. The dim light flickered as it neared, casting long, eerie shadows across the seats. The temperature in the carriage seemed to drop by several degrees. I could see my breath now, hanging in the air in front of me like mist. "Because you didn't listen," the voice replied, now clearer, more menacing. "You didn't leave when you had the chance." I stumbled backward, my back pressing against the cold metal of the train wall. I was trapped, cornered. The door was locked. The figure was closing in. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. I could hear the faint sound of my heartbeat, thumping louder than anything else in the world. My mind was racing, desperately trying to make sense of it all. Was I dreaming? Was this some sick prank? But the figure's presence was too real. Too tangible. I could feel the darkness it carried, seeping into the very air around me. It stopped just a few feet away. I could make out faint details now, a face, though it was blurred and distorted, as though it was being obscured by some unseen force. "You're not alone," the figure said softly. "Not anymore." I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped inside me. I was paralyzed. The oppressive weight of its words, of its presence, was too much. The train's lights flickered again, more violently this time, plunging the carriage into darkness. For a moment, I couldn't see anything, nothing but the pitch-black void. The sound of the train seemed to warp, twisting into an unnatural rhythm, as if something was interfering with it. And then, just as quickly, the lights returned. But the figure was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone in the carriage again, utterly alone. The seat across from me, the one where the shadow had been standing just moments before, was empty. I didn't know what to think. My body was still frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every sensation. The train slowed, the wheels grinding against the track as it pulled into another station. The lights of the platform flickered, casting a sickly glow into the carriage. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something was actually wrong with the station, too. The world outside seemed distorted, like a dream I couldn't wake from. I stood up, almost stumbling, as I made my way to the door. My hands were clammy as I reached for the handle, and I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Not again, I muttered, panic starting to take hold of me. I banged my fist against the glass, but no one came. No one heard me. The train had stopped, but I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I glanced nervously at my phone again. Nothing. No messages, no calls. No sign of anything abnormal, except the fear that was creeping over me like a cold wave. I had to get off the train. I had to get out of this place. But as I turned back to the window, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the reflection of the glass, I saw the figure again. Standing behind me. Closer this time. Too late, it whispered. I spun around. There was nothing there. Just the empty seats. Just the silence. But the cold, suffocating presence lingered. I could feel it in my bones. The doors wouldn't open. The station outside remained silent, too silent. And I was trapped in this unending nightmare with no way to escape. I reached for the door again, desperate to break free. But as my fingers brushed the handle, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The train started moving again. And this time, I wasn't sure where it was taking me. The train's movement was slow, unsettling. It wasn't the usual steady rhythm of a typical train ride. It felt like we were coasting, like the wheels were scraping over the track in deliberate, unnerving intervals. The faint hum of the train now seemed like a distant echo, a sound that had lost all its comfort. I pressed my face against the window, staring out into the dark night. The station had disappeared behind us, replaced by an endless stretch of blackness, broken only by the occasional flicker of distant lights. There were no other cars in sight, no signs of life. The landscape outside seemed to be swallowing us whole. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. But each time I turned, there was nothing. Just emptiness. My thoughts raced. What had happened? What was going on? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a strange encounter, this felt like something much worse, like I had been pulled into something beyond my understanding. The figure's last words echoed in my mind, too late. Too late for what? I could still hear the lingering trace of its voice in the back of my mind, even though I wasn't sure if it was real anymore or if my fear was playing tricks on me. I touched my phone again. It felt warm in my hand, but there was no message, no sign that anything unusual had happened on my end. It was almost as if the world around me was disconnected from the reality I knew. I glanced at the doors, still locked, still immovable. The sense of isolation was suffocating, as if the walls of the train had closed in on me, trapping me inside a place that was rapidly losing its normalcy. I needed to know if anyone else was on the train. Surely, I wasn't the only passenger left, right? There had to be someone else, someone to explain what was happening. I hesitated for a moment, but finally, I stepped away from the door and walked cautiously toward the other end of the carriage. My footsteps were eerily quiet against the linoleum floor, the only sound in the dead silence. The air seemed to grow thicker as I moved through the car. It was oppressive, like I was wading through an invisible force, pushing me back, making each step harder. When I reached the other end of the train, I found it empty. Completely empty. The lights flickered again, casting long, unnatural shadows over the vacant seats. I began to feel a knot tighten in my stomach. Something was wrong. Not just with the train, but with everything. There was no logical explanation for any of this. The station I had just passed was deserted. The phone calls had stopped. The figure had disappeared without a trace. But I knew it hadn't been a figment of my imagination. I had seen it, heard it. It was real. I turned back toward the front of the train, my heart hammering in my chest. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself on the wall. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, creeping under my skin, like invisible eyes were following my every movement. My breath quickened as I reached for the phone again, desperation rising. But before I could unlock the screen, the lights flickered once more, plunging the entire carriage into darkness. I froze. It wasn't the usual dimming of the lights. This was different. It felt like the entire train had been swallowed by shadow, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The air went still, and in that silence, I could hear the unmistakable sound of breathing. I wasn't alone. I turned around, my heart racing. The dark shape of the figure emerged from the corner of the carriage, stepping out of the shadows like a ghost, its outline jagged and distorted. It was closer now, so close that I could almost feel its presence pressing against me. Why? Why are you doing this? I gasped, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took another step forward, its face still obscured, but its movements deliberate and slow. I took a step back, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure finally said, its voice cold, like a whisper from a forgotten memory. "I don't understand," I said, my throat tightening. "What do you want from me?" The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. It didn't move, didn't even blink. Its presence filled the space, pushing me further back, into the corner of the train where the lights flickered again. The shadows around us seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally. The train continued to move, its motion now accompanied by the sharp screeching of the wheels, as if they were protesting the direction we were heading. "You should never have boarded," the figure said. "Now you're part of it. Part of the journey." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The words made no sense, but they were chilling all the same. The figure was speaking in riddles, but its tone was final, certain. "What journey?" I whispered, more to myself than to the figure. But it was too late. The doors at the end of the carriage slammed shut with a deafening sound, the metallic clang reverberating through the train. I whirled around, but I couldn't see anything through the small window. Nothing but the endless blackness of the night. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The lights flickered once more before returning to their dull hum. I was alone again, but I wasn't sure for how long. The eerie silence was now filled with a new weight, something deeper than before, a sense that I was no longer in control. Something had changed. The train slowed, and I could feel it pulling into another station. The moment I stepped off, would I ever truly escape? As the train screeched to a halt, I braced myself. Would the door open? Would the world outside still be real, or had I slipped into something I couldn't understand? With a trembling hand, I reached for the door handle. The door handle felt cold and foreign in my hand, as if it were made of ice instead of metal. For a moment, I simply stood there, my heart pounding violently in my chest, as if it were trying to escape. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. The figure, the disappearance, the strange silence that had swallowed the train, none of it made sense. But there I was, on the precipice of something that felt far worse than what I had already experienced. I pulled the door handle. It didn't open. I pulled again, harder this time, but the door was locked. My mind raced. Why wouldn't it open? We had arrived at the station. I could see the faint glow of streetlights outside, but it was unclear where the station ended and the night began. The scene outside looked almost surreal, like a half-formed dream, shadows too deep, the lights too bright, the world outside strangely still. I slammed my shoulder into the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic bubbled up inside me, and my breathing became shallow, rapid. The silence was deafening, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. And then I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a murmur, came from behind me. I froze, my blood running cold. That voice. I knew it well, even though I hadn't heard it in years. It was the voice of the figure, but now it was different. It wasn't the cold whisper from before. It was slow, deliberate, almost taunting. "You can't leave," it said, and I felt the words crawl under my skin, into my mind. Not yet. I spun around, but the figure was gone. In the place where it had stood, there was nothing but shadow, deep and unyielding. The train car seemed to be closing in on me, the walls contracting, the space shrinking. The air thickened, the temperature dropping rapidly. My breath came out in invisible puffs, clouding the air. The station outside looked unchanged, yet it felt like it had transformed into something else. Something darker. I could see the lights flickering, casting erratic shadows across the platform. A figure moved, but it wasn't clear whether it was a person or just another trick of the light. I felt the chill wrap around me, but it wasn't the cold of winter. It was something more profound, like the temperature of fear itself. I pressed my back against the door, still trying to open it, but the handle remained immovable. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice strangled with panic, but there was no answer. The world outside had become a blur of motion, yet I couldn't move. I was trapped. And then, the train jerked. It wasn't the usual smooth stop, it was an abrupt, jarring lurch, like the train had hit an invisible barrier, halting in its tracks. The lights inside flickered wildly, and the low hum of the train's engines sputtered to a halt. The entire carriage seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I could handle this. that it was just a moment of panic, that the train would start again, that I was just overthinking it. But I knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. The feeling of isolation had escalated beyond anything I had ever felt before. There was no escape. No one to hear me. No way out. The figure's words echoed again, louder this time. You're already part of the journey. I recoiled, realizing the truth. This wasn't just a strange encounter anymore. This wasn't about a passenger vanishing or a train getting delayed. This was something far worse. I wasn't just on a train, I was in something I couldn't escape from. The silence grew heavier, and I could feel my sanity slipping away, piece by piece. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing again, closer this time. My pulse quickened. I turned around, scanning every corner of the train. But there was no one there. Nothing. The platform outside was just as silent. It was as if the world had forgotten what sound was, what life was. I pressed my ear against the door, desperate to hear anything, to know if anyone else was there. But all I could hear was the endless void, the heavy, oppressive silence that swallowed everything. And then, the door opened. It wasn't the way it should have opened, no soft click or gradual shift. It simply opened, like the universe had decided it was time for me to step out. My breath caught in my throat as the world outside beckoned. I stepped off the train, my legs unsteady, my mind clouded with confusion and fear. The platform was barren. No people, no signs, no movement, just an endless stretch of darkness. But in the distance, I saw it. A figure, just standing there. It was waiting for me. I felt an icy chill run through me, but I couldn't turn back. The doors of the train slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty night. The train, now abandoned, began to slowly pull away, its lights flickering as it moved into the abyss. As I stood on that desolate platform, the figure slowly turned, its features still shrouded in shadow. It didn't need to speak. I already knew. I wasn't alone anymore. I was part of the journey, and I would never leave. The Stranger's Key. Chapter 1. The Key. It was a morning like any other when I discovered the key. A random moment, the kind that one never thinks twice about, yet would end up changing everything. I was preparing to leave the house, my mind lost in the usual routine of checking my pockets for my wallet, phone, and keys. But something was different that morning. As I reached into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushed against something I had not placed there, a small, cold metal object. It was a key. I stopped in my tracks, holding the object between my fingers. It was old, its surface worn from years of use, but it felt foreign in my hand. I had never seen it before. There was no name, no inscription, nothing to suggest where it had come from or what it opened. The weight of it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in my pocket. I turned it over, but there was no obvious clue to its purpose. It was just a key, simple in design, but strange all the same. How did this get here? I muttered to myself, but there was no answer. My thoughts flickered to the possibilities. Maybe I had picked it up somewhere without noticing, maybe it was from a long-forgotten drawer or lock. But that explanation didn't sit right. My gut told me something was off. I slipped it into my pocket and walked out the door, but the thought of that key gnawed at me. The entire day felt off-kilter, as if the key in my pocket had altered the course of events. It was a constant presence, pressing against the fabric of my jeans, a reminder of something I couldn't understand. The evening was quiet, the kind of stillness that made the world feel as if it had paused. On impulse, I found myself walking down the familiar streets, my hands buried deep in my pockets. As I wandered, my feet led me to an area of town I hadn't visited in years, a part of the city I had long ago learned to avoid. An abandoned building stood at the corner, its windows dark and shattered, its walls crumbling from neglect. The place was old, decaying, and forgotten by most. But as I stood there, staring at the building, I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach it. Something about the key in my pocket urged me forward. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I walked toward the building, my steps becoming heavier with each movement. But before I could question myself further, I found myself at the entrance. The large wooden door, weathered and warped, was slightly ajar. There was no sign of life. No sound, no movement. Just the eerie quiet of the place. I felt my heart race, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for my pocket, and without thinking, I pulled out the key. For a moment, I simply stared at it, feeling a chill run down my spine. Something was drawing me in, something I couldn't explain. I stepped forward, cautiously. My hand hovered over the door, and then, with a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, as if the lock had been waiting for this moment. I pushed the door open, the creaking of the wood cutting through the silence like a scream. The door opened fully. I stepped inside. The air inside the building was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The faint light from outside barely filtered through the cracked windows. The space seemed frozen in time, furniture covered in sheets, forgotten remnants of a life left behind. But it was the strange stillness that unnerved me. It wasn't just the silence, it was something deeper. A presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen anyone. I turned back to the door. It was still open, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. There was something inside that felt important. My gaze swept across the room, and that's when I saw it. A small, weathered chest, tucked away in the far corner, nearly hidden by shadows. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in this room of forgotten objects. My heart skipped a beat. The chest was locked. I knew, with a certainty that felt unnerving, that the key in my hand would fit. The key. The same key I had found that morning, the same key that had led me here. I moved toward the chest, my steps slow and deliberate. My hand shook slightly as I inserted the key into the lock. It clicked open, and I lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a single sheet of paper. It was old, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. But what struck me most was the writing on it. It was a message, written in hurried, frantic scrawl. You should not have come. Now you are a part of it. You are a part of the story. There is no turning back. The words sent a chill through my spine. I staggered back, clutching the paper in my hands as if it were something cursed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could anyone know I would be here? How could this paper be waiting for me in this chest, in this forsaken place? And then, as if the building itself had heard my thoughts, I felt a change in the air. The atmosphere grew heavier, colder. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I turned, panic rising in my chest. The building was no longer empty. Shadows moved, stretching unnaturally against the walls. A distant, echoing sound reached my ears, the faintest whisper of voices. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, as if it was pressing in on me, making it harder to breathe. The door that had once stood open was now shut tight, the handle cold and unyielding beneath my trembling fingers. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the shadows seemed to close in, curling around the edges of the room like living things. The voices started softly at first, faint murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to come from every direction, rising and falling like a soft, eerie wind. But as they grew louder, they began to form words. Words that seemed to reach deep inside my mind, filling the empty spaces with something wrong. You shouldn't be here. It's too late now. The whispers echoed in my ears, each word slipping under my skin, making my hands shake. I glanced at the chest, but it offered no comfort. That note, those words, had shaken me to my core. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't escape, something that was closing in on me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the voices were louder now. The shadows that had stretched along the walls were growing, twisting and writhing in unnatural ways. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls bending, the floor sinking. The space felt endless, like I was trapped in some kind of distorted, endless maze. I could feel the presence of something in the room, something watching me. Every hair on my body stood on end. It wasn't just the shadows that unnerved me, it was the way they moved, as though they were alive. They seemed to follow my every movement, curling closer with every step I took. I backed away, but the room kept shifting, and I felt more and more isolated, more and more like I was in some kind of twisted dream. You can't leave. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, sharp, and unmistakable. It echoed through the room, a command that resonated deep inside me. I froze. There was no mistaking it. That voice, it wasn't a person. It came from the walls, from the shadows, from somewhere I couldn't understand. Suddenly, something moved in the corner of my vision, just out of reach. A figure. Tall, dark, its shape barely perceptible in the shifting gloom. My body froze in place. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared at it, the more I realized it was real, very real. A pair of eyes appeared from the darkness, glowing faintly like embers in the night. They locked onto me, unblinking. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I was paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, its movements smooth and silent. It had no definite shape, no solid form. Just a shifting outline that seemed to melt in and out of the shadows. As it moved closer, I could feel an overwhelming coldness radiating from it, a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The key, still clenched tightly in my hand, felt heavier than ever, its metal digging into my palm. My mind raced, trying to piece together some explanation, some reason for why I was trapped in this nightmare. How had I ended up here? What did all of this mean? The figure was almost upon me now, its shadow swallowing up the space around it. Its eyes burned with an unsettling intensity, like they were staring straight into my soul. You should have never touched the key. The voice came from the figure, its words distorted and hollow, as if they were coming from within my own mind. It leaned in closer, its presence suffocating, pressing me back against the wall. I tried to fight it, to break free from the paralyzing grip it had on me, but it was no use. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone. The room was silent again. The shadows receded and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the fear remained. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow. I wasn't sure if what had just happened was real or if I had imagined it. But one thing was certain, the key had brought me here, and now I couldn't escape. I turned toward the chest, the notes still clutched in my hand. My eyes fell on the piece of paper again, but this time, the words on it had changed. The scroll was the same, but now it seemed to pulse, the letters shifting and rearranging themselves before my very eyes. You are a part of it now. There is no escaping. I dropped the note in horror, my hand shaking violently. What did it mean? What was this place? What had I unlocked? The voices returned, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. You can't run. You can't hide. My chest tightened, and I felt the walls closing in again, the air becoming suffocating. The room seemed to stretch on forever, and I could feel the presence of someone, watching me. Something that had been waiting for me all along. Suddenly, the door, the one I had tried to escape through, opened again. The voices stopped, and a cold wind blew through the doorway, sweeping the dust across the floor. I didn't wait. I ran. I bolted for the door, my feet pounding against the creaking wooden floor. But as I reached the threshold, something grabbed me, pulling me back. The shadows twisted around my legs, dragging me toward the darkness. There was no escaping now. My heart was pounding in my ears, my vision blurred with panic. I tried to scream, but the sound was trapped in my throat, suffocated by the weight of the air around me. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore, they were solid, real, like hands pulling at my limbs. I could feel them tugging at my legs, the coldness of their grasp seeping into my skin, making my body go numb. I fought against them, thrashing wildly, but the darkness only tightened its grip. I could hear the whispers again, louder, more urgent, swirling around me like a whirlwind. You can't leave. You're ours now. The voice was distorted, as if it were coming from inside my head. I clawed at the air, desperate for freedom, but the pull of the darkness was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. It was like the room itself was trying to swallow me whole. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could see the faint glow of the figure's eyes from the corner of the room, watching me, waiting. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the shadows was crushing me, dragging me back toward the heart of the room, toward whatever it was that lurked there. I was losing control. My thoughts were becoming clouded, distant. Everything felt unreal, like I was caught between two worlds, one that made sense, and one that was slipping further and further from my grasp. The key will open the way, the voice echoed, now coming from everywhere, surrounding me, consuming me. The key. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling as they wrapped around it. The cold metal sent a shock through my body, a jolt that somehow broke through the fog in my mind. I looked at it, the strange, unfamiliar key, now glowing faintly in my palm. It felt alive, pulsing with energy. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a key, it was the key. The one that had brought me here. The one that was keeping me here. The one that was connected to the darkness, to the shadows, to the thing in the room. And I had no idea how to stop it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were warning me. You don't understand. You don't know what you've done. With a surge of adrenaline, I forced myself to move. I pushed against the shadows, struggling to break free. But no matter how hard I tried, they pulled me back. I was sinking deeper, trapped in this strange, twisted space. The walls seemed to bend and shift, and suddenly, I wasn't sure which way was up. The room was a maze, its dimensions warped, stretched beyond anything I could recognize. It was no longer a simple, decrepit house. It had become something else, a place where reality didn't apply, where time and space twisted and bent like fragile threads. The key. I had to unlock something. There had to be a way to stop this. With all the strength I could muster, I forced myself toward the center of the room. The chest. The thing that had started all of this. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick mud, but I kept going. The whispers were nearly deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming in my ears, but I kept moving, determined to reach the chest. As I neared it, the shadows retreated, just for a moment. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. The key, my key, was still clutched tightly in my hand. I approached the chest with caution, afraid of what might happen if I opened it. But I had no choice. I placed the key in the lock. There was a click. The chest creaked open, revealing a dark void inside. There was no treasure, no object of value, just emptiness. The darkness inside seemed to suck in the light from the room, deepening the shadows. I hesitated, but something told me this was it. This was the moment. I reached into the chest, my fingers brushing against something cold. And then, I felt it, the presence. It wasn't just the shadows that I was dealing with now. There was something else, something beyond comprehension, beyond the walls of this room. The chest suddenly slammed shut, and the darkness around me erupted. The floor beneath me shook, the walls groaned as though they were alive. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the shadows began to move again, this time faster, more violently. They wrapped around my legs, pulling me to the ground, and I could feel them closing in, suffocating me. You shouldn't have come. The voice was louder now, clear and booming in my ears. The shadows closed in, swallowing me whole. The world around me blurred, my vision swimming. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before everything went black were the eyes, the same eyes I had seen before, glowing faintly from the corner of the room. They were watching me, always watching. And then there was nothing. I woke with a start, my body jerking upright, heart thundering in my chest. I was no longer in the strange, suffocating room. The darkness had lifted. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, that it had been some kind of nightmarish hallucination brought on by the stress of the key and the house. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light around me, I realized I wasn't alone. I was no longer in the room with the chest. The place I found myself in now was eerily quiet, the air thick with an oppressive weight. It was a hallway, narrow, lined with old, faded wallpaper, peeling in places as if the house had been forgotten long ago. A faint smell of mildew clung to the air. I sat on the floor, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had happened. My fingers instinctively reached into my pocket, and there it was, the key. Cold and heavy, as if it had been there all along. But this wasn't possible. How had I gotten here? How had I moved from one place to another? I pulled myself up, my legs shaky beneath me. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, silent. The distant creak of floorboards echoed through the house, but there was no one in sight. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, an inexplicable sense of being watched. A chill crept down my spine. I turned around, expecting to see something, someone. But the hallway behind me was just as empty as the one in front. The silence was suffocating. My mind raced. I had to get out of here. I needed to escape this place before I lost myself entirely. But the key... I looked at it again, my fingers tightening around its cool surface. The key, the one that had opened something I couldn't understand. I wasn't sure I wanted to understand it. There was something about this house, this place, that felt wrong. It wasn't just abandoned, it was alive in some way, as if it had been waiting for me. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence. A thud, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I turned around, my heart in my throat, but saw nothing. The hallway was still empty. But the footsteps continued, growing louder. Closer. I wasn't imagining this, I told myself, panic starting to creep in. The air around me seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping, and then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a whisper that slid into my ear. You're not supposed to be here. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway remained as it had been, empty, unsettling. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I knew I had to leave, had to find the exit. The house, no, this place, was playing tricks on me. And I was falling right into its hands. I stumbled forward, the echo of my footsteps the only sound in the vast emptiness. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning as though it had no end. Every door I passed seemed the same, old, withered, locked. The windows were sealed shut, no light breaking through. The deeper I went, the more suffocating the silence became. Then I reached a door. It was different from the others. The wood was smooth, untouched by time, and the brass handle gleamed as though it had been polished recently. The key fit perfectly. With trembling hands, I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room bathed in darkness. But there was something else there, a presence. I could feel it, thick and heavy in the air. Something was waiting for me on the other side. I hesitated, but only for a moment. My curiosity, my need for answers, pushed me forward. I stepped into the room. It was not a room at all. It felt more like a space suspended in nothingness, as though the walls had dissolved into the darkness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. You shouldn't have come. The voice was back, distorted and echoing, swirling around me from all directions. I spun, trying to locate its source, but all I could see was darkness. It was suffocating, pressing on me from every angle. My chest tightened, and I felt the panic rising again. We were waiting. The sound came from behind me, and I turned just in time to see a figure materialize out of the shadows. It was tall, its face obscured by a hood, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, focused entirely on me. I tried to move, but my feet were glued to the spot. My body refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of unseen forces. You belong to us now. Its voice was cold, empty, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words caught in my throat. I could only stand there, paralyzed, as the figure drew closer. Then, suddenly, the key, the one still clenched tightly in my hand, began to burn, its metal heating up against my palm. I let out a strangled gasp, trying to pull my hand away, but it was as if the key was pulling me in, drawing me toward the figure, toward whatever it was that waited for me in the dark. I felt myself moving against my will, my body betraying me as I was dragged closer to the figure. "The door is open now," the figure whispered. "But you may never leave." I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how much more I could take. But in that moment, with the key burning in my hand, I realized something. The key was part of this. It was the doorway, the invitation. And now that I had opened it, I wasn't sure if I could ever close it again. The world around me twisted and warped, and the shadows closed in. The burning sensation in my hand was overwhelming. The key seared into my skin as though it had become a part of me, an anchor pulling me deeper into the void. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my heart hammered so loudly that it drowned out everything else. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating, as if the air itself thickened around me. "You can't escape," the voice echoed again, an empty promise that seemed to reverberate in the very core of my being. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my throat ached, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. The shadows that surrounded me seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in from all sides. The key burned hotter now, and I realized with sudden horror that it wasn't just the key, it was me. I was the one being drawn into this place, my very essence entwined with whatever lay beyond the door. The figure reached out, its hand elongated and unnatural, like a shadow in the shape of a person. It hovered just in front of me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker beneath the hood, something human, something familiar. But before I could focus on it, the figure stepped forward, and the world around me went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the dark room. The key was still in my hand, though now it felt cold, distant, like it belonged to someone else. I was standing outside. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across an empty street. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. I looked around, disoriented, trying to piece together what had just happened. The house, the hallway, the shadows, were they real? Or had they been a dream, a terrifying figment of my imagination? I didn't know. But as I stepped forward, something caught my eye, a door. It was old, like the one I had seen before, but it wasn't on the house. It was standing on its own, as if it had been pulled from the earth, its brass handle glinting in the setting sun. I felt a strange compulsion, a need to approach it, to understand. The key in my hand grew warm again, as if it recognized the door and was beckoning me toward it. Against every instinct, against the screaming voice in my mind telling me to run, I walked towards the door. Each step seemed to take longer than the last, the world around me slowing, distorting. The door seemed to grow larger the closer I got, its presence undeniable. And as I reached for the handle, I saw the reflection in the glass. It wasn't mine. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure from before, its face still hidden beneath the hood, was standing behind me. It didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze, as cold and empty as before. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it faded into the darkness, leaving me alone once again. I hesitated. The key was burning in my hand, urging me to open the door. But I couldn't. Not again. Not after what I had seen, what I had felt. The figure, the dark presence, it had followed me, it had waited for me. But I couldn't leave. Something inside me refused to walk away, as if I was trapped by forces beyond my comprehension. The key was more than just an object, it was a part of me now. And no matter how hard I tried to resist, it was dragging me back, pulling me toward the door I had already opened once. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what I might find on the other side. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the emptiness, and the darkness beyond swallowed me whole. I don't know how much time passed. I don't know if time even matters here. But when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer standing in front of the door. I was somewhere else. The air was thick with a palpable silence, and the ground beneath my feet felt uneven, as if I was walking on something that shouldn't exist. My legs were unsteady, my mind a blur, but I knew one thing with horrifying certainty: I wasn't alone. The house was gone. The world around me was unfamiliar: empty streets, broken buildings, the remnants of something once alive. I turned in every direction, but there was nothing. Nothing except the faint echo of footsteps, growing closer with each passing moment. A whisper danced through the air. "You belong to us now." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard before, the voice of the figure, the voice of the house, the voice of whatever had drawn me here. My body froze, a cold sweat trickling down my spine. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see, but I knew I had no choice. I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat. And there, standing just beyond my vision, was the door. The same door I had seen before, now impossibly placed in the middle of an empty street. It called to me. The key in my hand seemed to thrum with energy, pulling me toward it. I couldn't escape. I couldn't escape this place, this world of shadows and whispers. I stumbled forward, unable to fight the pull any longer. As I reached for the handle, I felt a presence behind me, the weight of something watching, waiting for me to open it. But I already knew. There was no escape. Not anymore. The key had already opened the door, and there was no turning back. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.